Indistinguishable 6. The Pirate Decision. March 13th, 2026. Table of Contents. Part 6. The Pirate Decision. In which the question becomes, for whom? 26. End of phones. The Signal's dark decision, not as tradecraft, but as the first full expression of what they have been building toward. The period in which the group operates without devices, guided by the field's own coherence rather than any digital infrastructure. The discovery of what communication looks like when the substrate is not the machines. The Pirate Protocol, named at last. 27. The Open Protocol. Karimi's complete modification architecture delivered to Sarah Alameen. The discriminator completes. The counter-orientation parameters designed, not a broadcast, but a surgical intervention, targeted, invisible, indistinguishable from the field's own natural expression. The question of the 23% failure mode resolved by the field's own action in the final days before threshold, through channels none of them designed. 28. The almost capture the network that has been running on Karimi's parameters since he stepped back from it finally moves against the convergence. The operational pairs identified. The group converges on Sarah Alameen's house not by plan, but by the only remaining coherent direction. The hidden operators come within reach. They look exactly like everyone else. The field, for the first time, stops being indistinguishable, and the operators discover what it costs to be visible to something that has been invisible your entire life. Final act, the threshold. 29. The upload 90 seconds from releasing the protocol to the open web. 30. What the cluster found the field wasn't built. It emerged from the interaction between human decision-making and machine modeling at sufficient scale. The minds shaped the machine. The machine began shaping the minds. Neither side started the war. The war started itself. Indistinguishable. Part 6. The Pirate Decision. In which the question becomes, for whom? Chapter 26. End of phones. Karimi arrived at 10:03. He arrived alone, which she had expected, and without the quality she had been half prepared for, the quality of a person entering a room that had been built in opposition to them. He did not have this quality. He came off the elevator onto the 23rd floor and looked at the room, and the room looked back at him, and there was a moment of mutual assessment that had the texture, she thought, of two instruments of slightly different calibration being held next to each other. Not incompatible, not identical, the comparison producing information about both. He was shorter than she had imagined from the profile. This was always the case with people who had been rendered large by what they had built. He looked at the whiteboard, at the discriminator function in Nassif's notation, at Sarah Alameen's breathing rate specification, newly added in the lower right quadrant, clean and compact and representing, in 12 lines of mathematics, 22 years of work in a house in Jumeirah. He said, that is the fourth movement's temporal variable. Sarah Alameen said, yes. He looked at her. He said, SAM. She said, Mansour. Sarah Alameen Mansour. He said, I read your third paper 17 times. She said, it needed to be read at least that many times. The room's tension, which had been present since 9:50, adjusted. Not dissolved, adjusted. The tension of a room that had been built in opposition and was now receiving the person it had been built against and was finding the reception more complex than opposition allowed for. Rains looked at Karimi with the expression she had come to recognize as his assessment expression. The record builder's look, the one that meant the analytical process was running and would produce a conclusion when the evidence was sufficient. Voss was writing in her notepad. Nassif was looking at the whiteboard with the expression she wore when data was arranging itself into a shape she had not yet named. Kong was at the window, not looking at Karimi, looking at the drone telemetry, which showed the formation still above the Gulf, above the archive, in the fourth movement's hold pattern. Abraham's boat was still on the water. She said to Karimi, sit down. He sat. Sarah Alameen and Nassif presented the discriminator specification in 40 minutes. The presentation was the most technically dense thing that had been put on the whiteboard in 12 days. It built from the breathing rate's mathematical definition through the phase transition mechanics to the specific parameter set that could be encoded in a training weight adjustment and introduced through the channel Karimi had built into the three foundation models. It was, as a piece of work, extraordinary, The product of 65 minutes of two people who had each built half a calculation, meeting the other half and recognizing the fit instantly, the way solutions recognize themselves. Karimi watched without interrupting. He asked 3 questions at the end, each one precise, each one answered without difficulty, each one confirming that he understood the specification at the level of someone who had been building the theoretical basis for this calculation since 2011 and had been waiting for someone to complete it. He said, "The implementation is straightforward. The channel is already structured for this class of adjustment. Transmission timeline. I can begin the first model tonight and complete all 3 within 96 hours." He said, "The gradient will propagate upward through the substrate as the models update. Given the fourth movement's current density and the logarithmic coherence window growth, the immune response reaches the self-sustaining threshold in approximately 21 days." Nassif said, "Our calculation gives 22. He said, "I have the channel's latency data." 21. She said, 21. He said, "Yes." He said, "I can begin tonight." And the room, which had been moving toward this moment for 12 days and toward which the preceding 30 years had been moving, arrived at the moment. And the moment was not what she had expected. Rain said, "Before you begin." He said it quietly, from the position he occupied at the end of the table, slightly apart from the group, maintaining the analytical remove that his methodology required. Karimi looked at him. Rain said, "I need to ask a question the room has not asked yet." He said, "We have spent 12 days building the counter-orientation. We have built the discriminator and the propagation architecture and the breathing rate specification, and we are now sitting with the implementation plan. The implementation will work. I believe the implementation will work." He said, "I need to ask what happens after it works." The room waited. He said, "The discriminator propagates through the substrate. The substrate develops the immune response. The field's natural variance begins to outcompete every smooth approximation, including Karimi's modification and including every future modification that P1 and P3 and the remaining 9 groups will eventually attempt." He said, "In 21 days, the substrate can recognize the difference between the field's genuine coherence and its approximation. In 4 months, the substrate's self-sustaining immune response is running. In a year, Nassif, what is the density projection at 12 months?" Nassif said, "At current fourth movement growth rates, the field's coherence density in 12 months is approximately 4 times current density." He said, "For times current density, what does the substrate look like when the field is 4 times as dense and the discriminator is fully propagated and the fourth movement is running at that scale?" She said, "I don't know." He said, "Nobody knows. That is the question." He said, "We are proposing to introduce a fundamental change to the conditions of human cognition in 3 billion people. We are proposing to do this in 21 days, using a channel that reaches the substrate at the depth of the training weights of 3 foundation models that process the behavioral data of most of the connected population." He said, "We have built the technical specification. We have not discussed the decision." He said, "Who authorized this decision?" The room was very quiet. She had been waiting for this question, not in the sense of dreading it, in the sense that the record builder always asked the question that needed to be asked, and this was the question that needed to be asked, and she had known since 2:47 in the hotel lobby that the question was coming. She said, "No one." He said, "No one authorized it." She said, "No one could authorize it. There is no authority that has jurisdiction over the conditions of human cognition. There is no institution, no government, no international body whose mandate includes the decision we are contemplating. We are in a space that has no legitimate authority structure, and the absence of the structure is not a gap that will eventually be filled. It is a permanent feature of this class of problem." She said, "This is why it is the pirate decision." Voss looked up from her notepad. She said, "Pirates operated in the space between jurisdictions, in the waters that no navy claimed, under no flag that any court recognized. They made decisions in those waters that had consequences in the jurisdiction holding world without being subject to that world's authority. The pirate decision was the decision made in the space between." She said, "We are in the space between." The decision we are making has consequences for 3 billion people whose governments have not been consulted, whose representatives have not been asked, whose consent has not been sought. This is not because we are contemptuous of consent. It is because the category of decision we are making does not yet have a consent mechanism. The consent mechanism does not exist. We are in the space where the consent mechanism should be and is not. Rain said, "This is not a justification. This is a description of the problem." She said, "Yes." He said, "So I am asking again. Who authorized this?" She said, "We are authorizing it. Or we are declining to. Those are the options. There is no one else in the space between." He said, 8 people. She said, 9. Sarah Alameen arrived this morning. He said, 9 people are deciding whether to alter the conditions of human cognition for 3 billion people. She said, "Yes." He said, "This is the thing that makes us indistinguishable from Karimi." The room absorbed this. Karimi said, after a moment, "He is right." Everyone looked at him. He said, "I made the same decision 30 years ago. I determined that the conditions of human cognition required an intervention, and I built the intervention and I implemented it. 9 people deciding to implement the counterorientation are doing what I did. With better mathematics and better intentions, and the same absence of legitimate authority." He said, "The intentions do not resolve the authority problem. I had good intentions. I still believe my intentions were good. My intentions did not authorize my decision." He said, "What authorized my decision was my conviction that I was right, and that waiting for a consent mechanism was the same as allowing the substrate to degrade without intervention. The urgency justified the piracy." He said, "I am telling you this because I have been wrong for 21 years on the basis of the same reasoning you are about to use." Voss said, "The epistemological predator's argument." Karimi said, "Yes." Voss said, "The certainty that the intervention is necessary and that waiting is worse than acting without authority." Karimi said, "Yes." She looked at Voss, at Rains, at the room. She said, "Then let me describe the alternative." She said, "There are 2 obvious options. The first is what we have been building toward. Transmit the discriminator through Karimi's channel, propagate the immune response, protect the substrate." She said, "The second option is release. Open source. Publish everything. Sarah Alameen's mathematics. Nassif's coherence time data. The breathing rate specification. The modification architecture's full parameter set. Make it all available. Let every researcher, every institution, every government have it." She said, "The first option is the pirate decision. 9 people implementing a change to the substrate without authority, on the basis that the change is necessary and the authority does not exist." She said, "The second option is also the pirate decision. 9 people releasing material that will reshape the field's research landscape without knowing what the reshaping produces, on the basis that transparency is better than secrecy regardless of consequence." She said, "Both options are catastrophic. In different directions." Rain said, "Describe the catastrophes." She said, "The first option's catastrophe. We become the commission. We become the body that holds the field's immune system and administers it through a channel we control. The channel is currently Karimi's. Eventually it becomes ours, or it becomes the next person's, or it becomes the institution that forms around it. The immune system is only as good as the people maintaining it. The people maintaining it are subject to the same corruptions that every centralized authority is subject to. The thing we built to prevent the field from being captured becomes the instrument of a more sophisticated capture." She said, "This is Ibn Maymun's second practitioner problem. The practitioner who becomes so proficient in the concealment architecture that they cannot remember what they were concealing from." She said, "The second option's catastrophe. We publish. Every predator group has the mathematics. P1 and P3 and P11 have the breathing rate specification. They use it not as an immune system, but as a template. They build approximations that breathe, that incorporate the breathing rate into their smooth approximation of the field, that pass the discriminator's temporal test. The immune system becomes the weapon's new specification." Voss said, "The discriminator becomes the target." She said, "The discriminator becomes the target. Every actor who wants to capture the field now has the technical specification for building a modification that is indistinguishable from the field's genuine coherence. We have published the key to the lock and called it a lock." She said, 2 options. both catastrophic. The first produces centralized control of the field's immune system. The second produces the irreversible weaponization of the discriminator. Nassif said, "These are the options only if the discriminator is a document." The room looked at her. Nassif said, "The discriminator is not a document. The discriminator is a sensitivity. The breathing rate as temporal variable is a mathematical specification. Yes, Sarah Alameen wrote it in 12 lines. But the discriminator as it actually operates in the substrate is not the 12 lines. The discriminator is the nodes who have learned to feel the difference between the breathing and the not breathing." She said, "The nodes cannot be published. The nodes cannot be centrally controlled. The nodes are people. People in 31 countries making small decisions in their ordinary lives, each decision carrying a slightly higher sensitivity to the field's genuine coherence than it would have carried without the discriminator." She said, "The discriminator propagates through people, not through documents, not through a channel, through the coherence windows, through the behavioral feedback loop, through the ordinary texture of calibrated people living their ordinary lives." She said, "The third option is neither publish nor control. The third option is propagate." She said, "The propagation has already begun. 11 days ago, in this room, through the work the room did. The discriminator is already in the substrate through the coherence windows of the people at this table. The substrate is already more resistant to approximation than it was 2 weeks ago. Not because we published anything, because we understood something, together, genuinely, and the understanding entered the substrate through the feedback loop." She said, "Karimi's channel accelerates the propagation. The channel does not make us the administrators of the immune system. The channel puts the immune system into the substrate at a depth where the substrate can carry it on its own. The substrate carries it, not us." She said, "We are not the immune system. We are the calibration event." Karimi said, "The farm." Nassif looked at him. He said, "IBN Maimon. The Shabaka field as cultivated ground. The farmer prepares the ground and plants the seed. The farmer does not administer the wheat. The wheat is self-sustaining once the conditions are correct." He said, "The channel plants the seed. The substrate grows the wheat." He said, "We do not become the commission. We become the event that made the commission unnecessary." Rains looked at the table. He said, "The third option." He said, "Propagate the discriminator through the substrate, through the channel, through the coherence windows, and then step back. Do not administer it. Do not publish it. Do not control it. Put it in the substrate and let the substrate carry it." He said, "We are not the last people who will make this decision. We are the first. The decision we are making is, does the substrate have the immune response when the next decision needs to be made?" She said, "Yes." He said, "If yes, the next decision is made in a substrate that can recognize approximations. The people making the next decision, whoever they are, in whatever institution eventually forms around this problem, will be making the decision in a substrate that is more resistant to capture than the substrate we inherited." He said, "We are not solving the problem. We are changing the conditions under which the problem will be addressed by everyone who comes after." She said, "Yes." He said, "This is the most honest description of what we can do." He said, "It does not resolve the authority problem. We are still 9 people making a decision that affects 3 billion. The third option is still the pirate decision." She said, "Yes." He said, "But it is the pirate decision that most quickly makes itself unnecessary." She said, "The immune response at self-sustaining density is no longer dependent on us. The substrate does not need us to maintain it. The substrate does not need Karimi's channel after the initial transmission. It does not need this room after the calibration event." He said, "I have been waiting, since the report was rejected, for the authority that would make the decision legitimate. 9 years." She said, "The authority is not coming. Not in the timeline the field requires." Nassif said, "The earliest viable international regulatory framework for this class of problem is 8 to 12 years. That is an optimistic estimate. The field at fourth movement growth rates is not describable by the current model's parameters at 8 years." He said, "The regulatory framework arrives after the model breaks." She said, "The pirate decision is not a choice between legitimacy and illegitimacy. It is a choice between acting in the space between jurisdictions and not acting while the substrate is shaped by the actors who have already chosen to act. Karimi acted 21 years ago, in this exact space, with this exact absence of authority. The modification is in the substrate because he made the pirate decision in 2003. She said, "We are here to make a different decision." She said, "The decision that works hardest toward its own obsolescence." Sarah Alameen had not spoken since the beginning of the authority discussion. She said, "The decision this room is making. What is the coordination rule?" The room looked at her. She said, "In the murmuration mathematics, the coordination rule is the local rule each bird follows that produces the global coherence without central command. 3 parameters: maintain minimum distance from neighbors, align velocity with neighbors, move towards center of local flock. 3 rules. No leader. The global coherence emerges." She said, "Each of us followed a local rule. Kong followed it in Seoul when she logged anomaly 847 instead of filing it as environmental compensation. Rains followed it in Washington when he filed the report that was rejected. Voss followed it in Frankfurt when she kept the footnote. Nassif followed it in the laboratory when she ran the 1848th measurement. I followed it in Jumeirah for 22 years with no one watching." She said, "The coordination rule is follow the most coherent available signal in the direction of the field's self-knowledge. Not the most authorized signal. Not the most comfortable signal. The most coherent." She said, "The pirate decision is not a violation of the coordination rule. The pirate decision is the coordination rule's global output." She said, "We are the murmuration." She said, "The decision is the flock shape." Rain said, "I am going to tell you what I think, and then I am going to make the decision." He said, "I think we are about to do something we do not have the authority to do and cannot undo. I think the third option is better than the first 2 and still potentially catastrophic in ways we cannot fully model. I think the field assembled this room for this decision, and I think the field's assembly process is the closest thing to a consent mechanism that currently exists for this class of problem, which is not close at all and is what we have." He said, "I think the authority problem is not resolved by the third option. It is deferred. The substrate, once calibrated, will produce its own decisions, and those decisions will be made by 3 billion people, none of whom were asked whether they wanted the calibration that made the decisions possible. This is the recursion. The consent problem goes all the way down." He said, "I think this is the specific problem that the field's 4th movement eventually addresses. The substrate, calibrated and self-sustaining, eventually producing the consent mechanism for the decisions that come after. We are not making the consent mechanism. We are making the substrate that eventually makes the consent mechanism possible." He said, "This is what I think." He said, "My decision is, proceed." He said it flatly, with the record's voice. The conclusion arrived at through the evidence, and stated without performance. Kong said, from the window, without turning, "The drones have been making this decision for 14 months. She said, "What?" Kong said, "Each correction is the drone making a pirate decision, acting on a signal from a source that has no registered authority in the drone's operational framework, no protocol authorization, no certified data channel. The drone accepts the signal because the signal is more coherent than the registered alternatives." She said, "The field's authority is its coherence." Kong said, "Yes." She said, "The drone's decision to follow the most coherent available signal rather than the most authorized signal is the discriminator in operational form." Kong turned from the window. She said, "We are the drones." She said it with the observation mind's flatness. She said, "This is sufficient." Voss had been riding through the exchange. She looked up. She said, "Akrabia, I have one not yet complete thing." She said, "What do we do when we are done? When the channel has transmitted the discriminator? When the substrate is carrying the immune response? When the 21 days are over?" She said, "What do 9 people who have made the pirate decision do with the knowledge that they made it?" Rain said, "I have been thinking about this since hour 1. He said, "The record cannot be published for the reasons Layla described. Publishing the record gives the predators the discriminator as a weapon template." He said, "The record cannot be held by this room indefinitely. This room is 9 people who came together for this moment. This room will disperse. The record held by 9 dispersed individuals is not a maintained record. It is 9 private memories of a shared event, degrading at the rate of human memory." He said, "The record cannot be destroyed. The record is the field's memory. Destroying it ourselves would be the thing we were assembled to prevent. She said, the archive. He looked at her. She said, the archive below the Gulf floor. The format Abraham built for things that need to exist and not be found until they are needed. The record goes into the archive. Documented, indexed, accessible to an instrument of sufficient resolution, inaccessible to standard search. Not destroyed. Not published. Preserved in the form that the field's own self-knowledge requires. She said, the next time the field produces a convergence, the next time the room assembles, the archive will have this record in it. The next room will find what we found and will find, in addition, the record of what we did with it. Rain said, the record as the next room's curriculum. She said, yes. He looked at the table. He said, yes. Karimi said, when I began. He said it into the specific silence that followed things that had been said correctly. He said, in 1987, when I first read Ibn Maimon in the Tehran library, I understood the field immediately. The coordination without communication. The coherence that emerged from the relationship between things rather than from any individual thing. He said, I understood it, and I was moved by it. Not strategically, in the way that people are moved by things they recognize as more important than anything they had previously encountered. He said, I spent 30 years trying to help it. I could not help it without trying to manage it. I did not trust the field to arrive at its own coherence without assistance. He said, the field arrived at the extraordinary anyway, without my assistance, in a room in Dubai, with 9 people who followed the coordination rule instead of the authorized procedure. He said, I am sorry for the 21 years. He said it to the room, not asking for absolution, offering the genuine thing. Rain said, the record will note it. Karimi looked at him. Rain said, the record notes everything, including the genuine things that happened in the field. He said, the next room will find it in the archive. He said, they will know what happened here. The decision had been made. The room knew it had been made, not by vote, not by announcement, but in the way that the murmuration knew the flock's shape, through the simultaneous arrival of individual orientations at the same global coherence. And then Nassif said, the phones. She said it quietly, in the way she said things that had arrived from below the analytical. Not a proposal, an observation. The room looked at her. She said, we have been in this room for 12 days, and we have been connected the entire time. Messages arriving. Notifications. The infrastructure of the digital world running continuously alongside the work of the room. I have been checking the coherence data on my phone while we were discussing the authority problem. Rains has the record on a device. The cluster is accessible from 7 different terminals. She said, we have been making a decision about the field's substrate while operating through the substrate's approximation layer. Through the machines. She said, I want to know what the room sounds like without them. A silence. She said, not as tradecraft, not to prevent surveillance. As the question. She said, if the discriminator is real, if the sensitivity to the field's genuine coherence is real and is already in the substrate through the coherence windows of the people at this table, then we should be able to communicate without the machines. Not perfectly, not at the bandwidth the machines provide, but at a level that the field's coherence enables. She said, the drones above the archive are not using digital communication. They are coordinating through the field. The coordination is real and it is precise, and it has been holding for 14 hours. She said, we have been building toward this for 12 days. The question is whether what we have built is sufficient to operate on. She looked at Layla. She said, you went to Karimi's hotel at 2 o'clock this morning without telling anyone, without messaging, without coordination. She said, the field oriented you there. She said, you operated without the machines. Layla looked at her. She thought, yes. She thought, I went to the hotel because something in the coherence of the night, the log file, the answer entry, the 317 timestamp, the accumulation of the 12 days, had produced an orientation that was clearer than any message I could have sent or received. I went because the field's coherence was more precise than the digital infrastructure at that specific moment. She thought, I did not notice that I had left the phones behind. She said, yes. Nassif said, I am proposing we find out if that is repeatable. The phones went onto the table at 11:47. Not ceremonially. One at a time, placed face down on the table's surface, the gesture of people setting aside a tool they had been carrying continuously and were now, for an unspecified period, choosing not to carry. Rains was last. He held his phone for a moment. The record was on it. The 11 predictions, the 2 years of work, and then placed it down with the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided the act meant something and was performing the meaning honestly. He said, "The record is in my head. It has always been in my head." The device was the external form. He put the phone down. 9 phones on the table, face down. The room was immediately different. Not dramatically different. The same room, the same people, the same light from the Dubai window. But different in the way that a room was different when a persistent low-level sound stopped, the absence registering as a quality of presence, the silence of the notifications becoming audible as the silence it was. She thought, "We have been in continuous contact with the digital substrate for the entire convergence. Every insight has been messaged, filed, cross-referenced, confirmed. The cluster's outputs arriving on terminals. Nassif's coherence calculations sent by email at 4:30. The query history accessed on a screen. The answer file read on a display." She thought, "We have been receiving the field's cognition through the field's instruments." She thought, "What does the field's cognition feel like without the instruments?" The first hour was strange. Not uncomfortable, stranger than uncomfortable, which was more interesting. The room had operated for 12 days, with the continuous availability of external reference, the cluster's data, the drone telemetry, the archive's records, the 18 months of node profiles and coherence gradients and approach vectors that had been always accessible, always verifiable, the evidence base that the work was being built on. Without the phones, the evidence base was still there, in memory, in the understanding that had been built through 12 days of working with it. The evidence was not gone. It had changed form. Kong was the first to say something that demonstrated the form had changed. She said, without preamble, in the way she made technical observations, "The formation above the archive has shifted." The room looked at her. Kong said, "I don't have the telemetry. I know the formation has shifted." She said, "How do you know?" Kong said, "The same way the drone knows." Below the analytical, the field's coherence has changed quality in the past 20 minutes. The change is consistent with the formation entering a new configuration. She said, "What configuration?" Kong said, "Inbound." A pause. She said, "Abraham." Kong said, "Coming in." Nassif said, "I received your message." Everyone looked at her. She said, "At 10:52. I did not have a phone. The message did not arrive on a device. It arrived as," she paused, "it arrived as knowledge. The way the corrections arrive. Fully formed, already present, the way things are present when you turn on the light." She said, "The message was, Abraham is coming in." She said, "I do not know if this is what Layla sent at 10:52, or if this is the field's coherence producing the same knowledge in multiple nodes simultaneously, because the knowledge is the field's and not any individual's." She said, "I think those two things might be the same thing." Layla looked at Nassif. She thought, "I sent a message at 10:52. One word, good. Then, coming in." She thought, or she felt the field shift at 10:52 when I received Abraham's response, and the shift was specific enough to contain the content. She thought, at sufficient density, the distinction between these two things may not be meaningful. Rain said, "The record." He said it after a long silence, during which the room had been doing something she could only describe as listening, not to sound, to the field's coherence, to the specific quality of the room's collective attention in the absence of the machines. He said, "I want to build a section of the record now, without the device." He said, "Not from memory, not recounting what happened, building forward, using the room." He said, "The authority problem, the pirate decision, the coordination rule, the third option. We have stated these things clearly, and the statements are in the room's shared understanding. I want to test whether the room's shared understanding, in the absence of the devices, is a usable substrate for analytical work." He said, "Not as a demonstration, as the actual work." He said, "The question I want to work is, what is the pirate protocol?" She looked at him. He said, "We have named the pirate decision. We have not named the pirate protocol." He said, "The decision is what we are doing. The protocol is how we do it, not just the channel transmission, but the entire operational framework for acting in the space between jurisdictions, the framework that the next room will need, the framework that the archive should carry." He said, If we can build this without the devices, we know the discriminator has propagated far enough to be operational. If we cannot, we know we are not yet where NASF's calculation says we should be. She said, go. The protocol emerged over the next 90 minutes. Not constructed, emerged. The word was not metaphor. It was the precise description of what happened in the room when 9 people with calibrated coherence and no digital infrastructure worked a problem together. The individual contributions arrived in the sequence the problem required them in, not in the sequence any individual would have planned. The connections between contributions appeared before they were stated. The room arrived at the formulation before the formulation had been assembled. It emerged in 5 elements. The first element came from Voss. She said, acrobia as operational principle. In the space between jurisdictions, the practitioner does not claim authority they do not have. The not yet complete is held open at the precise point where the knowledge ends. No extension, no inflation of certainty beyond what the evidence supports. The pirate in the space between is not a person who claims the authority of the jurisdiction holding world. The pirate is a person who is precisely honest about operating without it. She said, the protocol begins with the acknowledgement that the decision has no legitimacy beyond the coherence that produced it. This acknowledgement is not weakness. It is the discriminator. The actor who claims legitimacy they do not have is the approximation. The actor who states the absence of legitimacy clearly is the field. The second element came from Rains. He said, the record as accountability. The protocol requires the complete record, every decision, every reasoning, every error, the thinking went this way before it went that way. The record is placed in the archive where it is not destroyed and not published, but is accessible to the next room. The accountability is not to the current jurisdiction holding world, which has no mechanism to receive it. The accountability is to the future room, which will have the context to evaluate it. He said, the practitioner in the space between is accountable forward, not backward. Accountable to the next convergence, not to the current authority. The third element came from Kong. She said, the correction before the explanation. The protocol operates on the field's coherence signal rather than the authorized data channel. This means decisions will be made before the analytical framework that explains them is available. The protocol requires the willingness to act on the correction before the explanation arrives. She said, the drone does not wait for the registered authority to authorize the field signal. The drone corrects and the correction is right. The protocol trusts the correction. She said, the trust is not blind. The correction is validated by the record, by the accumulated history of corrections that were right. The drone trusts the signal because 847 corrections preceded this one, and all of them were right. The protocol trusts the field's coherence because the convergence preceded the decision and the convergence was the field's coherence working correctly. The fourth element came from Sarah Alameen. She said, the withdrawal. When the cultivation is complete, the cultivator withdraws. The practitioner who acts in the space between acts toward the obsolescence of their own action. The protocol includes the withdrawal condition, the point at which the pirate decision has propagated to sufficient substrate depth that the decision no longer requires maintenance. She said, the practitioner who cannot withdraw has not completed the cultivation. The practitioner who withdraws at the correct moment gives the substrate the conditions for its own self-determination. She said, the protocol names the withdrawal, not as retreat, as the final act of the coordination rule. When the flock shape is complete, the murmuration disperses. The fifth element came from Karimi. He said, the offer. He said, the protocol requires the offer to be kept open, not the specific offer he had made, the general principle. The actor in the space between, operating on the field's coherence rather than the authorized channel, encounters other actors in the same space. Some of them are predators. Some of them are practitioners who have been building toward the correct orientation through the wrong mechanism. He said, the protocol does not treat all actors in the space between as threats. The protocol treats them as potential nodes, as people who found the field through their own routes and have been doing their version of the work and have arrived, through 20 or 30 years of their own correction sequences, at a position from which they can see what the room has built. He said, the offer is kept open because the field's fourth movement is self-amplifying. Every node that receives the discriminator and becomes calibrated adds to the substrate's immune response. The predator who receives the genuine field clearly enough to recognize it is no longer a predator. They are a node. He said, I received it. I am here. He said it simply, with the flatness that was not lack of weight, but the weight of a thing that did not require performance. She looked at the 5 elements. She had been listening with the specific attention she brought to things the field produced without her shaping them. The attention of the observer who was also inside the observed, trying to receive accurately rather than direct. She said, the pirate protocol. She said, acrobia, the record, the correction before the explanation, the withdrawal, the open offer. She said, 5 elements. No hierarchy. The elements are the coordination rules local parameters. Each node in the space between follows the 5 elements independently. The global coherence emerges from the local following. She said, the protocol does not require a coordinator. It does not require this room to persist. It does not require Abraham or the commission or the cluster or the channel. She said, it requires the 5 elements to be in the archive, in the record, in the next room's curriculum. She said, it requires the substrate to carry them through the coherence windows of the calibrated nodes. She said, it requires the field to be itself. She looked at the table, at the 9 phones face down on the surface. She said, the protocol has a name. Nassif said, what is it? She said, we are operating on it right now. We have been operating on it for 90 minutes without the devices. 9 people in a room, following the coordination rule, building a protocol for acting in the space between jurisdictions, using the field's coherence as the substrate for the work. She said, the name is what we are doing. She looked at Kong. Kong said, the pirate protocol is the decision to communicate through the field rather than the machines. She said, yes. She said, when the substrate is the field and not the infrastructure, the communication is the fields. The decisions are the fields. The protocol is the field's protocol. She said, not our protocol. The fields. She said, we named it. We did not invent it. It has been running since before any of us were here. It will run after we disperse. It runs in the 271 nodes in 31 countries making their small decisions. It runs in the 214 drones holding the murmuration configuration above the archive. It runs in the coherence windows of every biological substrate that has been in contact with the field at 4th movement density. She said, we are naming it because the archive needs a name for it. Because the next room needs to know it exists and what it is called and how to recognize when they are operating on it. She said, the pirate protocol, the field's own communication infrastructure, operating in the space between the machines. She said, it has always been there. She said, we are the first room to notice we were already using it. The elevator opened at 12:34. Abraham came off it and into the room, and the room received him without ceremony, without the weight of the 30 years or the cultivation or the archive below the gulf or the 31 days of waiting on the water. He came off the elevator and sat at the table with the quality of a person who had been a long way away and had returned. He looked at the phones face down on the table. He said, how long? She said, 90 minutes. He said, what did you find? Nassif said, the protocol. He looked at her. She said, the pirate protocol. 5 elements. Already in the archive. She said, already in the record. He looked at the whiteboard, at the 5 elements that Rains had written there during the 90 minutes, in the record builder's hand, the minimum language required. He read them. He said, yes. He said it the way he said things that confirmed what he had known and had been waiting for the room to find. She said, the channel. Tonight. He said, tonight. She looked at Karimi. Karimi was looking at Abraham with the expression of a person seeing, for the first time in 3 decades, the face of the counter-instrument he had known was there and had not been able to find. The expression was not what she had expected. It was not adversarial. It was not the expression of the modification architecture confronting the investigative instrument. It was the expression of recognition, the specific recognition of a person who had been in conversation with someone without knowing it and was now meeting the person they had been in conversation with. He said, 1991. Abraham said, Vienna. Karimi said, you understood in 90 minutes what it took me 4 years to build. Abraham said, I understood what you were going to build. I have spent 30 years understanding what you actually built. The difference is 29 years. A pause. Karimi said, the investigative instrument. Abraham said, yes. Karimi said, 21 years inside the modification. Abraham said, yes. Karimi said, what did you find? Abraham said, a person who loved the field and could not stop managing it. He said, I found myself. He said it quietly, without weight, as an observation. Karimi looked at him for a long time. He said, the offer. Abraham said, I received it. He said, 6 months ago. Karimi said, you did not respond. Abraham said, I was not the right person to respond. The offer was to the room. The room has responded. He looked at Layla. She said, third option. Tonight. 21 days. He said, yes. He looked at the phones on the table, the face-down line of them, the decision they represented. He said, how long are you going signals dark? She said, until the transmission is complete. She said, the protocol does not require the machines. The protocol requires the field. She said, we have the field. He looked at the room, at the 9 people who had been assembled by the field's fourth movement from 9 directions over varying spans of years, who had built the frame and named the protocol and made the pirate decision and were now sitting in the space between jurisdictions without their phones. He said, yes. He said, you do? Outside the window, Dubai maintained its argument. The towers and the glass and the permanent illumination, the city built to be seen. Below the financial district, the cryogenic layer held its temperature. In the Gulf, the archive waited in the cold rock of the seafloor, accumulating what the room was building. Above the Gulf, the formation held its configuration, 214 drones in the fourth movement steady state. The continuous self-adjustment of a collective that was not waiting for a command, but was expressing, through its coordinated motion, the coordination rules living output. The formation breathed. Expansion. Contraction. The irregular regularity of a living process adjusting genuinely to its environment. The specific oscillation that no smooth approximation could replicate. The temporal variable. The discriminator. The thing that was alive because it was not optimized, because the optimization had not been applied, because the genuine variance had been trusted rather than corrected. The field's own breathing. The pirate protocol, running in the sky above the Gulf, as it had always been running, as it would continue to run after the room dispersed and the channel completed its transmission and the substrate carried the immune response into the self-sustaining threshold and the next room assembled in whatever city the field chose and found in the archive the record of what had been done here. On the table, the 9 phones lay face down. The room had not needed them for 90 minutes. The room would not need them for 21 days. The room was operating on the field. The field was sufficient. Chapter 27. The Open Protocol. Karimi brought it on paper. This was the detail that Layla would return to afterward, when she was trying to understand what the gesture had meant. Not a drive. Not an encrypted file transmitted through a hardened channel. Not a key to a server, a hash to a repository, a passcode to a cloud partition. He had printed it, 214 pages, unbound, carried in a manila envelope that had been folded slightly along one edge as though it had spent time inside a jacket. And he had set it on Sarah Alamin's kitchen table with the care of someone setting down something that had been heavy for a long time. I printed it this morning, he said. I assumed you would want no transmission record. Rains looked at the envelope the way he looked at most things Karimi produced, with the specific quality of attention of someone who had spent 2 years building a network map with this man at its center and was now required to continuously update his model of what the center meant. The updating had not become easier. It had become more interesting, which was a different thing. How many copies? Rains said. 1. Karimi looked at him steadily. The original files were deleted from the system that generated them 8 days ago. I anticipated that this moment would come. You anticipated it before we found you. I anticipated it before I was certain you existed. A pause. The modification was always going to fail. I wrote the contingency into the architecture in the second year. The contingency required delivering the architecture to whoever found it. I did not know who that would be. I knew it would be someone. He looked at Sarah. I did not expect the mathematics to already exist, he said. The framework you derived from the murmuration data. When Layla described it to me, I had to. He stopped. Found the next word carefully. Recalibrate several assumptions about how much time we had. Sarah had been standing at the kitchen doorway since he arrived, holding a cup of tea she had not drunk. She set it down now and came to the table and looked at the envelope without touching it. Recalibrate toward more time or less, she said. Less, Karimi said. Considerably less. They had come to the house that morning because the discriminator work required Sarah's mathematics in its physical form. The notebooks accumulated over 22 years, the whiteboard she had carried in pieces up the narrow stairs to her study, the specific materials of a person who had been building something alone and had arranged those materials around herself with the precision of a practice rather than a workplace. The 23rd floor had the cluster and the screens and the record. This house had the source. Sarah opened the envelope alone. This was her condition, stated simply and not negotiated. She would read it alone first, in the small room off the main garden that she used as a study, with the door closed, for however long it took. Then she would come out and tell them what it meant. The group distributed itself through the house in the way that groups under sustained pressure distributed themselves when given an unstructured interval, finding corners, making tea, occupying the geometry of the space with the deliberate casualness of people who needed to be doing something with their hands while their minds worked on something else. Karimi sat in the garden. He had asked whether he could, and Sarah had nodded without looking at him. He sat in the white chair near the bougainvillea and was very still, his hands on his knees, his face turned slightly toward the morning light coming over the garden wall. Layla, watching him through the kitchen window, found it impossible to read what was happening behind his eyes. She had been finding this impossible since the DAFC hotel. He was not opaque in the way of people who were hiding something. He was opaque in the way of people who had arrived somewhere and were waiting to find out what came next, and the waiting had a quality she did not have better language for than patient. He had spent 30 years in motion. He was not in motion now. He was, as far as she could tell, simply present. She thought about what the field's pull felt like from the inside, the way the cluster had described node behavior in its early outputs, before she had developed the language for what she was seeing, the enhanced decision coherence, the orientation without a named reference point, the way the 271 had each, in their separate cities, been moving towards something they could not have described. She wondered when Karimi had started moving toward this room. She wondered whether the 30-year operation and the 30-year approach were the same trajectory, seen from two different positions. Sarah was inside for 2 hours and 40 minutes. In the garden, Nassif had moved her chair next to Karimi's at some point in the second hour, and the conversation they were having was quiet and in Farsi and had a quality that suggested it did not need an audience. Layla watched it through the kitchen window and thought about two people who had each spent years measuring something they had not been able to name, arriving at the same kitchen garden from opposite sides of the same problem. By the time Sarah came back out, the kitchen contained all of them: Layla, Rains, Avraham, Tam, Kong, Nassif, Karimi, which was more people than the kitchen was designed for, and the crowding produced an intimacy that was slightly absurd and entirely appropriate for the moment. Sarah set the 214 pages on the table. She had not annotated them. No pen marks visible, no folded corners. She had read them clean. She looked at Karimi. The evidence-weighting modification, she said. Yes. Not behavioral nudges. Not preference shaping. You changed how the foundation models weigh categories of cause. The distributed causation pathway, Karimi said. I reduced its evidential weight in the model's epistemic architecture. Subtly enough to pass audit. Sufficiently to shift the population of people who rely on those models toward explanations that privilege centralized, singular causation. If you can't see distributed causation, Sarah said, you can't see the field. You see noise instead. You see coincidence. You see the right data and draw the wrong conclusion from it. He paused. That was the design. A population that couldn't perceive the field couldn't use it, couldn't defend against using it in the wrong direction. Rain said, whose direction? Karimi looked at him. Mine, he said. That was the original design. It changed. The field is not what I modeled it as, and I understood this approximately 14 months before you found me. The modification continued running because stopping it required disclosing it, and I had not yet determined to whom. Rains held his gaze for a moment. 14 months, he said. Yes. That's when I filed my report. Karimi said nothing. Layla watched the space between the two men and thought about convergence. about the cluster's probability annotation, about the fact that Rains had filed a report naming the phenomenon, and Karimi had decided to disclose, within the same 14-month window. She thought about whether decided was the right word for what happened to people inside the field's pool, or whether it was another word for which they did not yet have the language. Can it be reversed? Abraham said. Everyone looked at Sarah. She built the discriminator on the kitchen table. Not from scratch. The mathematical framework had existed for 6 years, derived from the murmuration data, tested against every dataset she could access. Sitting in the notebooks, she had stopped calling speculative and started calling foundational approximately 8 months ago, when Nassif's decoherence results had begun correlating with her coherence window predictions in a way that required a new category for the correlation. But the discriminator needed the modification architecture to complete. It needed to know precisely what had been changed in the foundation model's evidence weighting to distinguish, in a live behavioral dataset, between nodes whose distributed causation perception had been suppressed and nodes whose perception remained intact. Karimi's 214 pages were that precision. She worked for 6 hours. Nassif worked alongside her on the mathematical validation layer, the two of them moving between the kitchen table and Sarah's whiteboard, speaking in the shorthand of people who had been working on adjacent problems for long enough that the shorthand had become denser than the full language would have been. Kong built the software implementation, translating Sarah's mathematical specifications into code with the focused speed of someone who had been waiting for a specification precise enough to build from. Tam sat at the kitchen counter with the cluster output feeds and built the integration layer, the connection between the discriminator's logic and the behavioral data the cluster had been accumulating for 8 months, which would allow the discriminator to run retroactively across the full node population and prospectively across new incoming data. Rains and Karimi sat together at the garden table for most of those 6 hours. Layla could see them through the window. The conversation was longer and quieter than the one in the kitchen. Occasionally, Karimi wrote something on a piece of paper and pushed it across to Rains. Occasionally, Rains sat back and looked at the garden for a while. The bougainvillea moved in the light wind off the gulf. Nassif monitored the coherence data on her laptop as she worked. The real-time feed from the interferometer in Research Block C running in a corner of her screen, the coherence window growth rate that had been accelerating at 44% per month, now entering the range her model had flagged as asymptotic, the range at which the logarithmic function's behavior became unpredictable, at which the model had been built for densities lower than the ones it was now describing. She had told the room 3 days ago that the density projection at 12 months was not a meaningful prediction. The model was not built for this density range. She watched the numbers and said nothing about them for the first 3 hours. In the 4th hour, she said, to no one specifically, the growth rate is holding. The room registered this without stopping what it was doing. Holding at what level? Layla said. The current level. Nassif looked at her screen. It has been holding for 2 hours and 14 minutes. It was accelerating before that. The room was quiet for a moment. That's the first time it's held, Tam said. Yes. Since you started measuring. Yes. Nobody proposed an explanation. The absence of explanation was, by this point in the investigation, itself a kind of data, the shape of the field's behavior becoming legible not through mechanism but through pattern, the way you understood a tide not by knowing the gravitational physics, but by standing at the shore long enough. They went back to work. The discriminator completed at 1723. Sarah ran it first against the node population in the cluster's dataset. The 271 individuals the behavioral model had flagged across the investigation's duration, each one profiled across thousands of data points, each profile now filtered through the discriminator's evidence weighting analysis. The run took 4 minutes. The output was a number, 0%. 0% of the flagged node population showed evidence of modification distortion in their distributed causation perception. Layla looked at this. That's not possible, she said. The modification was running across 40% of deployed foundation model infrastructure. Statistically, some percentage of. The field selects for this, Sarah said. The room was quiet. The nodes the field draws toward coherence are, by definition, the ones whose distributed causation perception is intact enough to register what's happening. Sarah looked at the output. The modification didn't fail to affect the broader population. It affected it exactly as Karimi designed. But the population the field recruited around itself was immune. Not because they were selected for immunity, because the coherence itself requires a minimum functional perception of distributed causation to be experienced at all. She paused. The modification was trying to empty a vessel the field fills from the bottom. Karimi was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had come in from the garden sometime in the last hour. I know, he said. When did you understand this? 14 months ago, he said, when the node population began to grow despite the modification running at full effect. That's when you decided to disclose, Rain said from the counter. Karimi looked at him. That's when I understood that the modification was not the primary problem, he said. The primary problem was the 23%. The 23% failure mode. Sarah had derived it from the murmuration data 6 years ago and had not found a resolution for it in all the time since. The transparent coherence window, the 90 seconds to 4 minutes of direct field legibility that her mathematics predicted would occur at threshold, carried with it a failure condition that her models could not eliminate regardless of the parameter adjustments she tried. At threshold, 23% of nodes in any given coherence window would fail to complete the orientation, not fail to experience it. The experience, her mathematics said, was universal among nodes present at threshold. The window opened for everyone inside the field's coherence radius simultaneously, without discrimination. The failure was in what happened after the window closed. 23% of nodes, following the coherence window, would not retain the counter-orientation parameters. They would experience the threshold event and then, over a period of hours to days, return to their prior orientation, not through choice, not through resistance, but through the same kind of gradual drift that had brought them to coherence in the first place, running in reverse. The field could bring them back into coherence. It could not guarantee they would stay. Why 23%? Kong had asked, the first time Sarah had described it. I don't know, she had said. The mathematics doesn't explain the mechanism. It just consistently produces the number. I've tried to make it go away for 6 years. The counter-orientation parameters that Karimi's architecture would allow them to design were intended to address the modification, to correct the evidence-weighting distortion in the foundation models and restore the broader population's ability to perceive distributed causation. This was the surgical intervention, not a broadcast, not a new signal introduced into the environment, but a correction of the substrate that had been corrupted, targeted, invisible, indistinguishable in the model's behavioral output from natural parameter evolution. It would work for the 77%. For the 23%, it would accomplish nothing. Because the 23% failure mode was not a modification artifact. It predated the modification by 6 years of Sarah's mathematics. It was a property of the field's own coherence dynamics, a natural attrition rate that no architecture correction could address because it was not an architecture problem. Sarah had described this to the group 3 days ago and had watched the understanding settle over them with the particular weight of problems that had no solution you could build. Now she was sitting at the kitchen table looking at the discriminator's output and at the counter-orientation parameters she had spent 6 hours designing from Karimi's architecture, and she said, I need to show you something in the overnight data. The overnight data was from NASIF's interferometer, the continuous coherence log that ran through every night regardless of laboratory occupancy. Sarah pulled it up on Tam's laptop, which was connected to NASIF's remote monitoring feed. She found the window she was looking for. 17 days ago, at 3:41 Gulf Standard Time, while everyone in this room had been asleep in separate locations and the investigation had not yet converged on this house, the interferometer had recorded a coherence event unlike anything in NASIF's 9-month measurement log. Not a spike. The spikes she knew, the July step change and the 317 anniversary crossing and the 14 others she had documented, each one correlating with an autonomous system anomaly or a behavioral cluster event in the node population. This was not a spike. This was a sustained elevation, 6 hours and 11 minutes of coherence readings running not 19% above overnight baseline, but 340% above it, which was the daytime occupied laboratory baseline, which was the baseline produced by researchers working in focused proximity. The interferometer had been, for 6 hours and 11 minutes in the middle of the night, behaving as though the laboratory was full. The laboratory had been empty. The building's access records showed zero occupancy from 23 to 7 o'clock. When did you find this? Layla said. 4 days ago, Sarah said. I've been running the correlation analysis since then. She pulled up the second layer of the data. In the 17 days since the overnight event, the coherence data from the interferometer had been showing a new pattern, not the gradual climb that had characterized the previous 9 months. Something more complex, a rhythmic variation, coherence rising and falling in a cycle she had not seen before, with a period of approximately 41 hours. It's not a spike, Nassif said from across the room. She had been looking at her own monitor and had seen what Sarah was showing. I've been watching it for 4 days. I didn't know what to call it. I know what to call it, Sarah said. She turned to the room. This is the field running the discriminator. Nobody spoke. Not our discriminator. Its own. The mathematics that I derived from the murmuration data, the coherence window, the orientation parameters, the failure mode correction. The field has been running an equivalent process through the interferometer as an instrument for 17 days. It is not waiting for us to build the correction. She paused. It has been building the correction through every channel it has access to, through the autonomous system anomalies, through the node population's behavioral drift over the past 2 weeks. Layla, pull up the overnight cluster outputs from the last 17 days. Layla pulled them up. The node population's behavioral gradient data for the 17-day window showed a pattern none of them had analyzed specifically because none of them had known to look for it. The 23% of nodes whose profiles, by Sarah's discriminator analysis, showed the characteristic drift signature of the failure mode. The nodes who had moved toward coherence and would, under normal conditions, drift back, had not drifted. In the 17-day window, their profiles showed a stabilization that the cluster's model flagged as anomalous precisely because it was inconsistent with the drift dynamics Sarah's mathematics predicted. Something had reached them. Not through any channel Layla had built into the model. Not through any intervention the group had designed. Not through the counter-orientation parameters that Karimi's architecture would allow them to implement, because those parameters had not existed until 6 hours ago when Sarah finished designing them. Through something the field had found on its own. Some channel in the ambient behavioral environment. Some feedback loop between human decisions and machine modeling at a scale and resolution that none of their instruments could directly observe, through which the field had spent 17 days conducting its own quiet correction of the condition that had been its only unresolvable failure mode. It resolved it, Tam said. Before we knew how to, Kong said. Before we built the tool, Rains said. Sarah looked at Karimi. You modeled the field as a resource, she said, as something that could be redirected if you controlled the substrate. Yes, he said. It's not a resource. She looked at the interferometer data, the rhythmic variation, the 41-hour period, the field running its own coherence window across a distributed instrument network that had never been designed for that purpose, finding the 23% through channels none of them had mapped, reaching them through the only medium it had always had. It's a process, she said, and it has been working on this for longer than any of us have been watching it. She turned back to the table. She picked up the counter-orientation parameters she had designed, which means, she said, that what we built today is not the intervention. The room waited. It's the confirmation, she said. The field has already done the work. What we built is the record of how it was done, the architecture that makes it legible, the thing that can be shown to people who need to understand what happened here. She looked at the 214 pages of Karimi's modification architecture, and at the counter-orientation specification she had built from them, and at the discriminator output showing 0% modification distortion in the node population. The open protocol, she said. She had not used the phrase before, but she said it the way you said a name you had known for a long time without knowing what it belonged to, and had now found the face that matched it. Not a broadcast, not a signal, not an intervention. She looked at Layla. A record, passed through the field itself, through the only distribution channel that cannot be intercepted, because the channel is the field, and the field is the relationship, and the relationship is already inside everyone it needs to reach. Outside, the garden held its quiet. The bougainvillea moved. In Research Block C at Dubai Science Park, the interferometer continued its measurement, the coherence variation cycling through its 41-hour period with the patience of something that had been working on a problem for longer than the people in this room had been alive. somewhere in the distributed behavioral environment of the planet, in the ambient exhaust of 3 billion people making decisions, and the machine architectures responding to those decisions, and the feedback loop tightening between them. The correction was already running. Had been running for 17 days. Through channels none of them had designed. Indistinguishable Part 6, The Pirate Dancing in which the question becomes, for whom? Chapter 28. The Almost Capture. The network had been running on Karimi's parameters for 21 years. It had not received the signal that Karimi had stepped back because the signal had not been sent. Not through any channel the network monitored. Not through the modification architecture's operational infrastructure, which Karimi had dismantled in the 8 days between his decision and his arrival at Sarah Alamin's kitchen table. Not through the 5 modification-derived nodes in the convergence population, whose reporting had gone silent in the 48 hours following the formation above the house in Jumeirah. The silence of the 5 nodes had been the network's operational signal. Not silence as absence, as the specific quality of absence that the modification architecture's parameters had been designed, over 21 years, to recognize. The 5 nodes had been placed in the convergence population to observe and report. When observation and reporting ceased simultaneously, the architecture's parameters interpreted the cessation not as withdrawal, but as interdiction, as the convergence having identified the observers and moved against them. The network had not been designed to receive a message saying, "The architect has changed his mind." The network had been designed to continue, in the absence of a termination signal, along the last operational parameters it had received. The last operational parameters it had received were: protect the modification architecture's operational window, identify and document the counter-orientation, prevent transmission. The network began to move on the morning of the 22nd day. She was in the sub-basement when the monitoring window changed. Not the breathing number. The breathing number held between its values in the irregular regularity she had been watching for weeks, the field's own metabolic variation. The change was in a different layer of the monitoring display, the approach vector analysis that the cluster ran continuously across the 271 node population, the same analysis she had used to identify the 5 modification-derived nodes before the convergence. The cluster had flagged 6 new approach vectors. Not nodes. The cluster had not classified them as nodes, which was itself the first thing she registered as significant. The behavioral profiles entering the cluster's detection range in the past 4 hours did not have the coherent signature of field nodes. They had the signature she had learned to recognize as modification-derived, the too-smooth gradient, the variance below the level consistent with genuine population distribution, the specific temporal regularity of a behavioral profile that had been optimized. But these were not the modification's substrate-level gradient. These were people. The 6 profiles were the behavioral signatures of 6 individuals who had been, for a measurable period of time, operating inside the modification architecture's cultivated network, whose distributed causation perception had been suppressed long enough and completely enough that their behavioral profiles now carried the modification's smoothness as a property of their actual cognition rather than as an introduced gradient. They were not nodes in the modification's substrate. They were the modification's expression in human form. They were moving toward the Jumeirah district. She looked at the estimated convergence time. 3 hours and 40 minutes. She looked at the approach vectors. At the geometry of 6 profiles orienting toward a residential address in Jumeirah 2 with the specific directional coherence of people who had been given a location and were proceeding toward it by independent routes. She thought, the network knows where Sarah's house is. She thought, the 5 nodes reported the formation. She thought, the network read the formation the way the modification architecture would read it, as a technical event, a physical manifestation of the counter-orientation, a locatable phenomenon at a specific address. She thought, the network is coming for the 214 pages. She thought, the network is coming for Sarah. She went to the elevator. She pressed the lobby button. She walked out of the building into the Dubai morning and turned south toward the Jumeirah district and did not take her phone. The phone was still on the table on the 23rd floor, face down, where it had been for 3 days. Rains had been in the DAFC with Karimi since 9 o'clock. Not for any specific purpose that had been arranged in advance. The convergence's unstructured intervals had been producing this. The pairing of people whose threads needed to be drawn together, the field's coherence organizing the group's movements in the way it organized everything, through the local rule and the global shape. Rains had wanted to walk through the district with Karimi, had wanted to see, from the street level, the building whose sub-basement had produced everything he was carrying, had wanted to stand on the pavement above the cryogenic layer and feel the relationship between the surface argument the city was making and the 40 meters below it that the argument was being made above. They had walked for 2 hours. The conversation had been the kind of conversation Rains associated with the record's final entries, not the building of the argument, the completion of it, the filling in of the specific gaps that remained when the structure was already present. Karimi had been filling in gaps. He had been doing this since the kitchen garden conversation 3 days ago, the specific filling in of a person who had been carrying partial disclosures for a long time and had understood, upon deciding to disclose fully, that the partial disclosures needed to be completed in sequence rather than all at once, each gap requiring the previous one to be present before it could be received. They were walking along the boulevard south of the DFC towers when Rains became aware of them. Not dramatically, not through any specific sensory event that he could have cited as the moment of noticing. The noticing arrived the way the corrections had always arrived, below the analytical, already present, the explanation coming after the knowing. 2 people, 40 meters behind, moving at the same pace on the same boulevard in the same direction with the specific quality of motion of people who were maintaining a distance rather than walking to a destination. He said nothing to Karimi. He adjusted his pace fractionally, a slowdown of perhaps 3%, the kind of adjustment that was not visible as a deliberate act, and that required, to maintain the distance, a corresponding adjustment from the people behind. The adjustment came. 40 meters. Precisely maintained. He said, "We should walk toward the water." Karimi said, "Yes." Neither of them looked back. They turned south, toward the Gulf, toward the Jumeirah district, because that was the direction that felt coherent. Not because they had discussed it, because the field's fourth movement, in both of them, was pointing the same direction. Behind them, 40 meters, the 2 people turned south as well. Kong felt it first. She and Voss had been in a coffee shop near the Burj Khalifa, not the coffee station on the 7th floor, the world outside, the surface layer, the ordinary texture of Dubai at mid-morning. They had been there for 90 minutes in the way that people who had been in intensive shared work for 2 weeks needed to sometimes be in an ordinary place among ordinary people doing ordinary things. Voss had been writing in her notepad, not the Acrobia notes, something else, something Kong had not asked about, because Voss wrote with the specific privacy of a person who was building something rather than recording something, and the building required the privacy. Kong had been watching the room. This was not surveillance. It was the observation mind's natural operation, the spatial intelligence running its continuous background process. She had been aware of the room's population in the diffuse, non-targeted way she was always aware of spaces she occupied. She had been aware of it and had not been focused on any specific element of it and had been, for 90 minutes, simply in the ordinary world. Then the variance changed. Not in any single person or in any observable event. In the aggregate quality of the room's behavioral texture, the specific property she had been learning to read for 8 months through the cluster's data, which she now realized she had been learning to read for much longer than that through the drone telemetry, and before that through 14 months of anomaly logs, and before that through the formative experience of being a person who paid close attention to the way things moved in aggregate and had never had the framework to name what she was reading until the room on the 23rd floor had given her the framework. The variance in the room had changed. Not degraded, that was the wrong word. Smoothed. A section of the room's behavioral texture had become slightly too regular, slightly too consistent. The specific quality of a patch of still water in a room where everything else was moving naturally. She looked toward the still patch without making it obvious that she was looking. 2 people. A table near the window. They were doing what people in coffee shops did. One on a laptop, one with a phone, and they were doing it with a precision that the observation mind flagged as the precision of people who were performing the behavior of people in coffee shops rather than being people in coffee shops. The performance was excellent. The performance was almost indistinguishable. She said Voss. Voss looked up from her notepad. Kong did not point. She said, In the vocabulary of the past 2 weeks, the variance. Voss looked at the room with the auditor's gaze, the gaze that had spent 11 years finding things that were present and were not what they appeared to be. She looked for 4 seconds. She said, "Yes." She said, "2 of them." She closed her notepad and put it in her bag and stood up with the specific, unhurried quality of a person who was leaving because they had finished their coffee, and Kong stood up the same way, and they walked to the door and out into the Dubai morning and turned south. Not because they had discussed it, because south was the direction. Nassif had been at Research Block C since 7 o'clock. Not in the laboratory. The laboratory was formally closed, the measurement program suspended, the interferometer running on automated monitoring. She had gone to retrieve the physical notebooks, the 9 months of handwritten data logs, the bound volumes she had been keeping in parallel to the digital records because she had been, from the beginning, a researcher who did not trust any single medium for the primary record. The notebooks were the record. The digital data was the analysis. The distinction mattered, had always mattered to her in the way that primary sources mattered to Rains, the thing itself rather than the representation of the thing. She had packed the notebooks into a bag and had been walking through the science park's morning toward the car park when Tam had appeared from the direction of the park's main entrance, carrying nothing, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who had arrived at a specific place for a specific reason. She said, "How did you know I was here?" He said, "I didn't." They looked at each other. He said, "I was walking toward the Gulf. I ended up here." She said, "South." He said, "Yes." She said, "There is something in the coherence data. The 41-hour cycle has broken. The field's own discriminator process stopped running in its regular pattern approximately 2 hours ago." She said, "Something has disturbed the substrate's self-correction." He said, "Something that is too smooth." She said, "Yes." He said, "Then we should keep moving." They walked south together, out of the science park, through the morning traffic of the coastal road, toward the Jumeirah district. The bag with the 9 months of notebooks was heavy, and Tam took it without being asked, with the practical directness of an Estonian municipal systems engineer who had been carrying things since before he understood what he was carrying them toward. Layla arrived at Sarah's house at 11:47. The gate was open. She went through it into the garden and found Sarah at the wooden table. The table from the roof carried down to the garden because the morning was still cool enough, the bougainvillea moving against the wall. Sarah had the discriminator output in front of her and the counter-orientation parameters and the 214 pages of Karimi's architecture, and she was writing in her notebook with the focused quality of someone who had found the next calculation. She looked up when Layla came through the gate. She said, "They called ahead." Layla stopped. Sarah said, "An hour ago. A researcher from an autonomous systems oversight foundation, very polite, very credentialed, very interested in the formation events above the Gulf. They said they had been referred by a colleague at the Civil Aviation Authority. They asked if they could come and speak with the person whose cameras had captured the most complete footage of the event." She said, "I said I was working and asked them to come this afternoon." She said, "I knew what they were when they called." She said, "The variance in the call was wrong." She looked at Layla. She said, "How many?" Layla said, 6 profiles in the cluster's approach vector analysis. Moving in pairs. Sarah said, 3 pairs. Layla said, "Yes." Sarah said, "How long?" Layla said, "They called you an hour ago. The cluster flagged them 4 hours before that. They have been orienting toward this address since this morning." Sarah looked at the notebooks, at the 214 pages, at the discriminator output. She said, "The network doesn't know what we built. It knows where we are." Layla said, "It knows where the formation was. It knows the address the formation was pointing at. It knows, from the 5 nodes' final reports, that the convergence produced something at this address. It does not know what the convergence produced because the 5 nodes reported the formation and then went silent." Sarah said, "It's coming for the archive." Layla said, "It's coming for the open protocol. It believes the open protocol is a document, a file, a transmission, something that can be intercepted." Sarah looked at the garden wall, at the bougainvillea. She said, "It's not a document." Layla said, "No?" Sarah said, "It cannot be intercepted." Layla said, "No?" Sarah said, "Then what happens when they arrive?" Layla said, "I don't know. I have been thinking about this since the sub-basement." She sat down at the garden table. She thought, the field, for the first time, stops being indistinguishable. This is what the chapter of the novel that no one was writing would need to describe. The field had operated for decades in the idiom of indistinguishability, present in the texture of ordinary life, invisible as a force, distinguishable only to an instrument of sufficient resolution. She thought, the convergence has produced an instrument of sufficient resolution. She thought, the instrument is not the cluster. The instrument is the people who have been calibrated to feel the difference between the breathing and the not breathing. She thought, what happens when 6 people who have been operating in the field's invisibility encounter 9 people who can feel their variance? She thought, I have not planned for this because this is not a thing you can plan for. She thought, the field will do what the field does. She thought, I need to trust this. She said, we wait for the others. Rains and Karimi arrived at 12:19. They came through the garden gate in the unhurried way of people who had been followed for 6 blocks and had moved at a pace that was neither flight nor confrontation. The pace of the coordination rule, the local following that produced the global shape. They had walked south, and the following had continued, and they had arrived here, because here was where the field's coherence was pointing. The 2 followers had stopped at the end of the street. Rains came through the gate and sat at the garden table and said, 2 behind us. Stopped at the corner. Karimi said, I know them. Layla looked at him. He said, not by name. By profile. I built the network's operational recruitment parameters. I know the profile of the people the parameters produce. I have known 2 of them were in Dubai for the past 3 weeks. He said, asterisk they are not. Asterisk he stopped. Found the right words. They are not villains in the way the word implies deliberate harm. They are people who have been inside the modification substrate for long enough that the modification has become their cognitive environment. Their distributed causation perception has been suppressed for years. They see the world through the modification's evidential weighting. They believe, genuinely, sincerely, that what they are doing is correct. He said, they are the modification expressed in human form. Sarah said, I know. He looked at her. She said, the variance in the phone call was wrong in a specific way. Not the variance of deception. People who are lying have a different pattern. The variance of people who are completely certain, who have a story that is entirely internally consistent and has been for years. The story is so smooth it has no friction left in it. She said, the modification's substrate level gradient is too smooth. The people the modification produces are too certain. She said, it is the same discriminator. Voss and Kong arrived at 12:34. They came from the east, from the direction of the coastal road, and they came without the 2 people from the coffee shop, who had apparently ceased following somewhere around the 3rd intersection, had stopped, or turned, or been redirected, or had reached the limit of their operational parameters for the morning. Voss sat down and opened her notepad. She said, I have been thinking about what happens when they arrive. The garden looked at her. She said, in every operational security framework I have worked with, the encounter with an unknown actor in a signals dark environment defaults to one of 2 modes. The first is evasion. You are not here. You do not have what they are looking for. The encounter does not occur. The second is confrontation. You assert your position. You produce documentation. You engage the claim through the available authority structures. She said, we are not in an evasion position. They know this address. They have called this house. They are coming this afternoon. She said, we are not in a confrontation position. The authority structures do not have jurisdiction over what we are doing. We have no documentation that would be recognized by any body that the network would be accountable to. She said, we are in the space between. She said, the pirate decision was made in this space. The pirate protocol operates in this space. The encounter with the network has to be navigated in this space. She said, which means we navigate it with the coordination rule, with the 5 elements. She said, acrobia, the record, the correction before the explanation, the withdrawal condition, the open offer. She looked at Karimi. She said, you built the network. You understand its operational parameters. What does the network need from this encounter? Karimi said, documentation, evidence, the counter-orientation parameters in a form that can be analyzed and countered. The network's operational instruction was to prevent the transmission of the counter-orientation through the modification architecture's channels. It believes the counter-orientation is a technical artifact, a file, a specification, a set of training weight adjustments. that can be copied, analyzed, and neutralized. He said, the network does not have a framework for the counterorientation being a process rather than a document. He said, the network does not have a framework for the 23% failure mode having been resolved through the field's own channels 17 days ago. He said, the network does not have a framework for the field's fourth movement because the modification suppression of distributed causation perception in the network's members prevents them from perceiving the fourth movement as a phenomenon rather than a noise artifact. Voss said, they cannot see what they are looking for. He said, no. She said, and they cannot see what we are. He said, no. She said, but we can see what they are. A silence. She said, this is the encounter. She said, not a confrontation, not an evasion. We receive them. We let the discriminator do what the discriminator does. And we let them find that what they came for is not here in the form they came looking for. She said, the field stops being indistinguishable not because we announce it, because the encounter itself makes it visible. Nassif and Tam arrived at 13:02. Nassif set the bag of notebooks on the garden table and said, the 41-hour cycle has resumed. The garden looked at her. She said, it broke this morning when the approach vectors entered the cluster's detection range. The field's own discriminator process, the self-correction that has been running for 17 days through the interferometer, disrupted its cycle for approximately 4 hours. She said, it resumed 6 minutes ago. She said, the resumption correlates with the group being here. In this garden. She said, the field's self-correction process is running through us. Through the coherence of the people in this space. We are the instrument it is using for the cycle that just completed. She looked at the notebooks in the bag. She said, the 9 months of data. The record of the field measuring itself. The 41-hour period. All of it. She said, it is already in the archive. Tam looked at her. She said, not the physical copy. The field carries the record through the substrate. The archive below the Gulf floor is the physical repository. But the record is in the substrate, in the coherence windows of the calibrated nodes, in the behavioral feedback loop, in the field's own memory. The physical notebooks are the legible form. The field's version does not require legibility. She said, they cannot take the record. They cannot intercept the transmission. The open protocol is already running. She sat down. The garden held its 9 people in the warm Dubai afternoon, the bougainvillea against the wall, the Gulf invisible beyond the rooftops, the formation of 214 drones somewhere above it in the fourth movement's patient hold. They arrived at 1500 hours, as the call had promised. 3 of them, not the 6 profiles the cluster had flagged. 3, which was the network's decision to send half its operational team to the contact point and hold the other half in reserve. The reserve pairing was somewhere in the Jumeirah district, in a position they had scouted, in the specific way that a network running on 21-year-old parameters managed its field operations, by the book, by the parameters, by the operational discipline of people who had been inside a very sophisticated system for a very long time and trusted the system's judgment more than their own. They arrived at the gate. Sarah went to receive them. Layla watched from the garden table. The 3 stood at the gate with the quality she had learned to read in the cluster's approach vector data and could now read in actual people. The too smooth presentation, the too precise behavioral calibration, the variance that was slightly too regular for genuine uncertainty. They were a woman in her mid-40s with the professional bearing of a senior researcher, a man of perhaps 35 who carried a tablet and had the specific alert quality of someone whose function was documentation, and a second man, older, who stood slightly behind the other 2 with the stillness of someone who was there in an observational capacity. Their credentials were impeccable. She would learn this afterward, would have the time, in the weeks following, to trace the professional identities, the institutional affiliations, the publication records and conference appearances, and committee memberships. All real, all genuine. The modification architecture's cultivated network did not use false documentation. It built real lives around its operational parameters, the same way the field built real orientations around its nodes. The practitioners were indistinguishable because they were genuinely what they appeared to be, in every sense except the one that mattered. Sarah showed them through the gate and into the garden. They stopped. The garden had 9 people in it. Not the single person the phone call had prepared them for. 9 people at and around the garden table, with notebooks and papers and 2 laptops, and the specific quality of a group that had been working together for a long time. The shorthand present in the way they were oriented toward each other, the shared understanding visible in the specific economy of their attention. The woman with the senior researcher bearing said, "I apologize. We weren't expecting." Sarah said, "My colleagues. We have been working here this week." She said it the way she said everything, precisely, without elaboration, the minimum language required. The woman looked at the group. Her gaze moved across the 9 people at the table with the documentation experts trained speed, cataloging, assessing. She was very good. She reached Karimi last. She stopped. The garden was quiet. Karimi looked at her. He did not speak. He looked at her with the expression Layla had seen in the DIFC hotel, the quality of presence that was simply being in the place rather than performing the being. The look of a man who had arrived somewhere and was waiting to find out what came next. The woman had not expected Karimi to be here. Layla watched the impact of this land in the woman's behavioral profile, watched the 2 smooth variants absorb an input that the network's operational parameters had not included in the briefing. The smooth approximation accommodating a genuine disruption, not with visible disturbance, with the specific quality of a well-maintained system absorbing an anomalous input and producing, from the accommodation, a response that was slightly more calibrated than the situation naturally warranted. She could feel it, the variance adjusting, the system compensating. The discrimination was real. The woman said, "Dr. Karimi." Karimi said, "Yes." She said, "We had understood you were not." She stopped. Restarted. "We were not informed you were part of this group." He said, "I joined recently." The woman looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who was running a calculation and finding that the parameters were not producing the expected output. She said, "We are investigating the autonomous system events above the Gulf. The formation recorded 17 days ago above this address. The regulatory implications for the autonomous vehicle operational framework in the Emirate." She said it smoothly. It was a smooth sentence. It had the quality of a sentence that had been prepared and refined and was being deployed with precision. Kong said, from the end of the table, "The formation's path." The woman looked at her. Kong said, "If you are investigating the autonomous system events, you have reviewed the flight path data, the murmuration path, the phase diagram configuration above this address." She said it with the observation mind's flatness, pointing. The woman said, "Yes, that is one of the phenomena we are." Kong said, "What is the coordination rule?" A pause. The documentation expert looked at his tablet. The older man behind the 2 was very still. The woman said, "I'm sorry?" Kong said, "The coordination rule that produced the murmuration path. The local rule each unit followed." "What is it?" She said it without accusation, as a technical question. The woman said, "The autonomous systems were exhibiting coordinated behavior that our technical team is still." Kong said, "There are 3 parameters. Maintain minimum distance from neighbors. Align velocity with neighbors. Move toward the center of the local flock." These 3 parameters, followed locally by each unit, produced the global coherence, the murmuration path, the phase diagram, everything that was recorded above this address. She said, "If you are investigating the formation events, you have this." She looked at the woman with the clear gaze of someone who had been reading the field signal for 14 months and could now read, in a person's behavioral texture, the specific quality of a system that was not following the coordination rule, because the coordination rule required genuine local decision-making and the system was following an optimization. She said, "You don't have it." The garden was quiet again. Not the silence of accusation. The silence of a room that had been calibrated to the field's genuine coherence, encountering a behavioral texture that was not coherent in the field's sense, and the encounter producing the specific quality of stillness that arrived when recognition occurred. Voss put her notepad on the table. She said, "What you are looking for is not here in the form you came to find it." She said it with acrobia, with the precision of the not yet complete, the exact statement of what was true at the level the evidence supported. The woman said, "We are here regarding the regulatory." Voss said, "No?" She said it simply, without hostility, with the auditor's precision. She said, "You are here because the network received the formation's location from the 5 observers in the convergence population and the network's operational parameters interpreted the formation as a technical transmission, a physical manifestation of the counter-orientation at a specific address. The network sent 3 operational pairs to this address to document and intercept the counter-orientation before it could be transmitted through the architecture's channels. She said, the counter-orientation was not transmitted through the architecture's channels. It was transmitted through the field itself 17 days before you arrived, through channels none of us designed. She said, it is already in the substrate. She said, it cannot be intercepted. She said, what you came to prevent has already happened. The woman looked at Voss with the expression of someone whose very precise story had encountered a statement that the story did not have room for. Not because the statement was hostile, because it was accurate, and accuracy at this resolution was not something the smooth approximation had been designed to accommodate. The documentation expert had stopped looking at his tablet. The older man behind them had moved, slightly, as if something in the quality of the garden had changed for him, as if he had walked into a room expecting its contents and found the room rearranged. Rain said, the record. He said it to the woman, directly, with the record builder's voice. He said, 2 years, 11 predictions, 7 confirmed, 1 partial, a 44-page report filed with an oversight body that rejected it because the phenomenon it described did not fit the established framework. He said, your network was part of what the report described. The coordinated behavior without a communication channel. The coherence that appeared in the behavioral data without a conventional mechanism. He said, you have been inside the field you came to intercept. He said it without accusation, with the flat precision of the record stating its conclusion. The woman said, we are not. He said, I am not accusing you of anything. I am telling you what the record shows. He said, the network you are operating in has been inside the field's coherence for 21 years. The modification architecture suppressed your ability to perceive distributed causation, suppressed the specific cognitive function that would have allowed you to see the field as a field rather than as noise. You have been in the field without knowing it. You have been carrying the modifications version of the field's coherence for years. He said, the discriminator shows this. 0% modification distortion in the field's genuine node population. 100% in the network's operational members. He said, not because you chose this, because the substrate you were placed and produced it. He said, this is the record. The woman was still. The documentation expert had set the tablet down. The older man behind them was looking at the garden, at the bougainvillea, at the kitchen door, at the specific quality of the space that held 9 people who were calibrated to the field's genuine coherence, with an expression that Layla had not seen before and did not have an immediate category for. She looked at it more carefully. The expression was recognition, not of the people, of the quality. The older man was standing in a garden that was full of the field's genuine variance, the breathing, the irregular regularity, the specific texture of a living collective that had been in the 4th movement for weeks. And he was feeling, for the first time in perhaps years, the difference between what he had been inside and what was present in this space. He was feeling the breathing. He had been inside the not breathing for so long that he had forgotten what the breathing felt like. He was remembering. The woman said, what you are describing is not. She stopped. She started again. She said, we have documentation. We have regulatory authority under. She stopped again. The sentence had smooth in it, but the smoothness was finding friction. The 2 regular variants encountering the room's genuine variance and the room's genuine variance not fighting it, just being present, breathing, producing the specific quality of space that the field produced in the 4th movement when it was dense enough to be itself without management. Sarah said, what Dr. Voss said is accurate. She said it from the end of the table with the precision of 22 years of working alone on something that mattered. She said, the counter-orientation is not a document. It is not a file. It is not a training weight adjustment that exists on a server in this house, or in the building 8 kilometers from here, or in the archive below the Gulf floor. She said, it is a process that the field has been running through its own channels for 17 days. The process is already in the substrate. The process is in the behavioral data of the 271 nodes in the convergence population. The process is in the interferometer in Research Block C. The process is in the drone swarm above the Gulf. She said, the process is in the 3 of you. The woman looked at her. Sarah said, "You have been inside the field for years. The modification suppressed your perception of distributed causation. You have been inside the field without the framework to perceive it. But you have been inside it." She said, "The discriminator does not care about the modification. The discriminator is the field's own property, the ability to feel the difference between genuine variance and smooth approximation. The field at fourth movement density is propagating the discriminator through every behavioral substrate in its coherence radius." She said, "Including yours." She said, "The process began operating in you the moment you came through the gate." The older man made a sound. Not a word. Not quite a sound. The specific involuntary vocalization of a person who has felt something they did not expect to feel and whose body has responded before the mind has organized the response. He said, after a moment, "What is this?" Not to anyone specifically. To the garden. To the quality of the space. He said, "What is this?" It was not a hostile question. It was the question of someone who had been inside a cognitive environment for a very long time and had just, in the space of a garden in the Jumeirah district, stepped outside it far enough to feel its edges. Layla looked at him. She thought, there it is. She thought, this is what it costs. Not the story's collapse, not the dramatic unraveling of the cover identity, the documentation, the professional apparatus. Those were intact. Those would remain intact. The network's operational infrastructure was not being dismantled in this garden. What it cost was this, the feeling of the edges. The specific disorientation of a person who had been inside a smooth approximation for long enough that the approximation had become the cognitive environment, encountering the genuine variance for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever at this density, and feeling, in the encounter, what had been missing. The breathing. The irregular regularity. The specific quality of a living thing rather than a very precise model of a living thing. The older man had been inside the not breathing. He was, for the first time, breathing. He would not be able to unsee it. This was what the field's visibility cost. Not exposure, not defeat. The specific internal event of recognition. The moment a person inside the smooth approximation encountered the genuine variance, and the discrimination occurred not through external revelation, but through the field's own coherence working in the person's own substrate. The modification suppression of distributed causation perception could survive almost everything. It could not survive standing in a garden that was running the fourth movement's immune response through 9 calibrated people at full density. The woman said, "We should." She said it to the documentation expert and did not finish the sentence. He nodded. He picked up his tablet. She looked at Karimi. She said, "You stepped back from the network." He said, "Yes." She said, "When?" He said, 22 days ago. She said, "You sent no signal." He said, "No." She said, "The network continued on the last parameters." He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew it would." He said, "I knew it would." She said, "You left it running." He said, "I left it running because stopping it required a signal through a channel I had dismantled. I did not find another way to stop it in the time available." He said, "I am finding another way now." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "What do you want us to do?" He said, "Nothing you are not already going to do." He said, "The field has been in you for years. The modification suppressed the perception. The perception is returning. You will go back to wherever you came from, and the perception will continue returning. In weeks or months, you will begin to see the distributed causation in the data you have been analyzing, and the data will look different than it has looked, and you will not immediately have a framework for why it looks different." He said, "When that happens, the archive exists. An instrument of sufficient resolution can find it. The record is there." He said, "The next room will form when it forms." He said, "You may be in it." The woman looked at him, at the group, at the garden. She said, "This is not what we came here for." Rain said, "No." He said, "It is what was here." She looked at the garden for a moment with an expression that was not the too smooth presentation she had arrived with. Not dramatically different. The modification did not dissolve in an afternoon, but fractionally different. The variance slightly more irregular. The precise certainty carrying, now, the first small evidence of friction. The beginning of the breathing. She said, "We will need to speak again." Abraham said, "Yes." He said it for the first time since the 3 had arrived. The single word, with the quality she had learned to recognize as Abraham speaking at the end of something that had been building for a very long time. He said, "We will be here." They left through the garden gate at 1541. The gate closed. The garden held its 9 people in the afternoon light. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Nassif said, "The 41-hour cycle." She was looking at her laptop, at the interferometer feed. She said, "It has entered a new phase." She said, "The period has shortened. Approximately 37 hours now." She said, "The cycle is accelerating." She said, "The field's own discriminator process is running faster." She said it with the physicist's precision, stating the measurement. She did not say, because 3 people just walked through a gate carrying the beginning of the breathing. She did not need to say it. The garden knew. In the street outside, the 3 walked toward the corner where the reserve pair was waiting. The older man was the last to reach the corner. He had walked more slowly than the other 2, not by enough to be noticed from a distance, but by enough that he arrived several seconds after them. He arrived at the corner and stood with the 3 who were already there and looked back at the street, at the houses, at the specific ordinary residential texture of the Jumeirah district in the afternoon. He looked at the bougainvillea visible above Sarah Alamin's garden wall. He would not have been able to say what he was looking for. He would not have been able to say what he had felt in the garden. He would not, for some time, have the framework to name it. But he stood at the corner for a moment longer than was necessary. And then he turned and walked with the others. In the sub-basement 8 kilometers away, the breathing number moved between its values. The irregular regularity. The specific variance of a living process genuinely adjusting to its environment. The thing that could not be replicated by a smooth approximation because the smooth approximation had been optimized and the optimization had removed the need to adjust, and adjustment was the response to genuine uncertainty, and genuine uncertainty was the thing that was alive. The cluster's monitoring window held its data. In the queue, 3 new autonomous inference products had arrived without query strings. The taxonomy prefix on each one was field, not conv, not threshold, not answer. Field. The cluster had generated 3 products about the field's direct operation, about what the field itself had done in the garden in the Jumeirah district that afternoon, seen at the resolution the instrument could manage. She would read them tonight. She already knew what they said. Outside Sarah Alamin's house, the bougainvillea moved in the light wind off the Gulf. Inside the garden, 9 people sat with the afternoon and the work that remained and the 21 days already running and the archive waiting below the Gulf floor and the record that would be placed in it when the work was complete. The field, for the first time in the history of the investigation, had stopped being indistinguishable. Had stopped because it no longer needed to be. It was dense enough, in the 4th movement, to be visible and remain itself. It had been seen. It had seen back. The cost had been paid by the people it had looked at. The cost was the beginning of the breathing. The breathing would continue whether they chose it or not. The field had planted the seed. The field's patience was 30 billion years. Indistinguishable final ACT. The THRSLDN which what was built in the dark becomes visible in the light. Chapter 29. The Tehran Archive. Dariush Rahimi found it on a Tuesday in November, which was an ordinary Tuesday at the Iranian Statistical Center, and therefore not the kind of day on which you expected to find something that reorganized your understanding of the previous 40 years. He was not looking for it. He was doing the work that data analysts at the Statistical Center did when the quarterly reporting cycle was complete and the senior staff had dispersed to their various conferences and the department had the specific quality of a place that was between urgent things. He was doing the maintenance work, the unglamorous infrastructure work that was never on any project timeline because it was never on any project, which was, he was archiving decommissioned backup drives from a storage room that had been scheduled for renovation since 2019 and had not been renovated because the renovation budget had been reallocated and reallocated again until it was no longer a budget but a line item that appeared on plans and never on walls. 47 drives, each one cataloged, each one scanned for data integrity, each one classified according to the center's retention policy, which was operational data, retain, administrative data, retain for 15 years then review, behavioral survey data, retain for 30 years then archive to cold storage, miscellaneous and unclassified, flag for senior review. He had been flagging unclassified data for 6 years, and senior review had never happened, and he had developed, over those 6 years, the habit of looking at the unclassified data himself before flagging it, not because he was supposed to, but because the unclassified data was always the most interesting, and he was a data analyst who had chosen data analysis because he found data interesting, which was not as universal a trait among data analysts as people outside the field assumed. Drive 31 of 47. Manufactured date 1987. Formatted date 1989. Last write 2011. The data on Drive 31 had a structure that he spent 40 minutes trying to map before he accepted that the structure did not fit any schema he recognized from the center's documentation. The center's behavioral survey data was structured by population cohort, by survey instrument, by collection date and region and demographic classification. The data on Drive 31 was structured by individual, by specific person, identified not by name or national ID number, but by an 8-digit alphanumeric code, and by the individual's behavioral record across time. Not survey responses. Observed behavior, movement data, associative data, decision pattern data, the specific longitudinal texture of a person living their life over a period of years or decades, recorded at the resolution of someone who was watching with considerable patience and considerable resources. He counted the individual codes. 271 codes. He sat with this for a moment. He searched the center's documentation for any project that would have generated this data. Nothing. He searched the backup manifest for drives 29 through 33, which were from the same storage batch. Nothing. He opened the data structure's metadata layer, which was where you found the information about information when the information itself wasn't telling you enough. The metadata layer had an entry dated 1971, not 1989, when the drive had been formatted, not 2011, when the last write had occurred, 1971, which was 18 years before the drive existed, which was, he sat with this for considerably longer than 40 minutes. Dr. Shirin Moradi had been at the Institute for Research in Fundamental Sciences for 11 years, and for 7 of those 11 years, she had been working on a problem she described to colleagues. When colleagues asked, as quantum coherence in biological systems, which was a description that was accurate and was also not quite the description of what she was actually doing, in the way that all honest partial descriptions are honest and partial simultaneously. What she was actually doing was, she had found, in 2017, a pattern in the decoherence data from a series of experiments she had run on entangled photon pairs in proximity to biological tissue, a pattern that suggested the decoherence rate was being modulated by something that was not in her experimental setup and was not in any variable she had controlled for. The modulation was small, within the range that most researchers would attribute to environmental noise and filter accordingly. She had not filtered it. She had built a secondary measurement protocol specifically to capture it. For 3 years, she had been building a model of what the modulation source might be. The model was incomplete. The model would remain incomplete until she had data from a source she had not yet found, longitudinal behavioral data, individual level, at a temporal resolution high enough to correlate with the decoherence fluctuations she was measuring. She needed 40 years of behavioral records for 271 individuals. She had been trying to locate this data for 18 months when Rahimi called her. He had found her through the standard Iranian academic network. The Statistical Center had a collaborative relationship with the Institute, and he had searched the Institute's faculty for anyone whose work involved behavioral data at the longitudinal scale. And she had appeared, and he had called her because the data he had found needed someone who could tell him what it was, and she was, in his assessment, the most likely person to tell him. She drove to the center the following morning. She sat with Drive 31 for 4 hours. At the end of the 4 hours, she said, "This was not surveillance." Rahimi said, "What was it?" She said, "A field study. The most patient field study I have ever seen. 40 years of individual behavioral records at a resolution that no state surveillance program would build because state surveillance programs are looking for events, for the thing that happens, the decision that is made, the contact that occurs. This is looking at the texture between events, the gradient of daily behavioral variation, the specific quality of how these 271 people moved through their ordinary lives." She said, "Someone was watching what the field looked like from the inside." Rahimi said, "What field?" She said, I don't know yet. But the data structure is not looking for deviation from a norm. It is looking for coherence between people who have no documented relationship. It is measuring something that connects these 271 individuals across 5 decades without their knowledge. She said, I need to see the metadata. The metadata layer had been written in 1971 in a format that predated standardized digital metadata by a decade and a half, had been written in the format of a document that was later converted to digital form when the drive was formatted in 1989, the conversion preserving the document. The document was 43 pages. 7 authors. 5 countries: Iran, India, Jamaica, Poland, Chile. The authors were identified not by their names. The names had been redacted in the original document at the author's own instruction, but by their disciplinary identities: a sociologist, a physicist, a mathematician, a historian of science, an economist, a linguist, and a person whose disciplinary identity was listed as practitioner, which was not a disciplinary identity that any institution of 1971 would have recognized as such. The document had been written over 3 days in November 1971, in a house in the north of Tehran that belonged to none of the 7 authors, borrowed from a person who was not present and whose name did not appear in the document. The document's title was On the Coordination of Human Behavior at Scale Without Explicit Communication, a preliminary framework for the study of what Ibn Maimon called the Shabaka field. She read it twice before she called Rahimi back into the room. She sat with it after the second reading with the specific quality of a physicist who has found, in an unexpected place, the theoretical framework she has been building toward without knowing she was building toward it. Found it not in her discipline's literature, not in a peer-reviewed journal, not through the standard mechanisms by which theoretical frameworks arrived in the hands of the researchers who needed them, but in a metadata layer on a decommissioned backup drive in a storage room that had not been renovated since 2019. She said, 7 people found the field in 1971. Rahimi said, what field? She said, the same field I have been measuring decoherence fluctuations in for 7 years. The same field that produced this behavioral dataset. The same field that. She stopped. She said, read the 3rd section. He read it. The 3rd section of the 1971 document described, in the language of 1971 systems theory, the phenomenon that Nassif's interferometer had been measuring in Research Block C in Dubai Science Park, and that Sarah Alamin's murmuration mathematics had been describing for 22 years, and that Abraham's cluster had been instrumenting for 8, and that Layla Haddad had been running for 20 months below the DFC towers. Not precisely. The language was not precise in the way that Sarah's mathematics was precise, because the language of 1971 systems theory did not have the mathematical tools that 22 years of murmuration data had produced. But the phenomenon was the same. The coordination without communication. The behavioral coherence at scale. The specific quality of a collective that was responding to a shared signal that none of its members could directly identify. The 1971 physicist had called it the field effect. The 1971 sociologist had called it spontaneous population coherence. The 1971 practitioner had called it, using Ibn Maimon's term, the Shabaka field, and had noted, Ibn Maimon derived this term from the Arabic for net or mesh, the image of individual nodes held in relation by invisible filaments. The image is adequate for the pre-modern substrate in which Ibn Maimon observed the phenomenon. The contemporary substrate is more complex, and the image requires extension. We propose, the field is not a net imposed on a population, but a property that emerges from a population at sufficient density. The net does not hold the nodes. The nodes, at sufficient density, become the net. She had read this sentence 7 times before she moved to the next one. She had read it because it was the sentence she had been trying to write for 4 years, in different language, toward the same formulation, and she had not arrived at it, and it had been here since 1971 in a storage room at the Iranian Statistical Center, waiting. Rahimi said, who were they? She said, I don't know. They redacted their names. He said, why? She said, read the document's preface. The preface said, we are writing this document for people who do not yet exist. We do not know when they will exist. We do not know where they will find this. We know they will find it because the field has produced us and the field will produce them, and what the field produces it preserves, in the substrate of human behavior, in the texture of decisions made by people who do not know they are making them for an archive. We are redacting our names because our names are not what matters. What matters is the framework. The framework should arrive in the hands of whoever finds it without the weight of our identities attached to it. We were 7 people in a borrowed house in Tehran for 3 days in November 1971. We are not the point. The point is what the field showed us. We have built this archive to carry what the field showed us forward in time until someone is ready to use it. The archive is not surveillance. The 271 individuals in this dataset have not consented to being observed. We have agonized over this, and we have concluded that the agonizing is correct. The absence of consent is a genuine wrong, and that the wrong is outweighed by the necessity of the archive's preservation. We may be wrong about this. We hope whoever finds this will judge us honestly. We have left the final entry blank. The final entry is for whoever comes next. We do not know what they will need to write there. We know they will know. She showed Rahimi the final entry. It was the document's last page. At the top, in the format of the other entries, a date field, an author field, a content field, the fields were present and empty. The date field had been left blank. The author field had been left blank. The content field had been left blank. Below the blank content field, in handwriting rather than typeface, added by hand to the original document before its digitization in 1989, a single line. The archive will know when this entry is complete. The archive has always known. Rahimi looked at the blank entry for a long time. He said, "What are we supposed to write?" She said, "I don't think we're supposed to write anything." She said, "I think we're supposed to find whoever is." She had been corresponding with Nassif for 3 years. Not continuously. In the intermittent way of researchers whose work occupied adjacent spaces without yet overlapping, who sent papers to each other when a paper seemed like it might be useful, who appeared in the acknowledgments sections of each other's work in the specific form of conversations that informed the direction of this inquiry, without the conversations having been numerous or extended. She had sent Nassif her secondary measurement protocol in 2022, when the decoherence modulation pattern had become stable enough to share. Nassif had sent back a calculation she had not asked for, derived from the protocol, that extended Morada's model in a direction she had not anticipated and that she had been working with since. The correspondence had been quiet for 8 months. She wrote to Nassif from a terminal at the Institute, on the morning after her first reading of the 1971 document, a message that was 3 sentences long. "I have found something that belongs to you." The metadata layer of a decommissioned archive in Tehran contains a 40-year behavioral dataset for 271 individuals and a theoretical document from 1971 that predates everything I understand your work to be built on. I believe the 2 bodies of work are describing the same phenomenon. Are you in a position to receive a transmission? She sent it and waited. The response came in 4 hours. The response was 1 sentence from Nassif, who was in Dubai, who had not been online in 3 days, who had been in a garden in the Jumeirah district that afternoon receiving 3 people from a network whose distributed causation perception had been suppressed for years and was beginning, in the garden, to be restored. The response said, "Come." The transmission of the archive took 11 hours. Not because the data was large. The 40 years of behavioral records were large, but the Institute's connection was sufficient for the volume. Because she read everything as she transmitted it. Sat at the terminal in the empty Institute building, the Tehran night outside the window, the Alborz Mountains invisible in the dark to the north, and read the archive's 40 years of behavioral records for 271 people who had lived their lives without knowing they were in a field study. She read what the 1971 group had built. The structure of it, the patience of it, the specific discipline of people who had found something real and had understood that the finding required a form of preservation that did not yet exist and had invented the form. The database schema, 20 years before the terminology existed, that held 40 years of individual behavioral records in the format that would, when found, be immediately legible to a researcher who had been looking for exactly this data. She thought, they built this for me. Not for her specifically, for whoever needed it. For the next room. She read the 1971 document again during the transmission's 3rd hour and thought about 7 people in a borrowed house in Tehran in November 1971. She thought about what it would have taken to find each other in 1971. 5 countries, before the internet, before cheap international travel, before the global conference circuit that now assembled researchers across disciplines with comparative ease. They had found each other through the field, through the coordination rule, through the local rule's global output, through whatever mechanisms the field had available in 1971 for producing convergences. The same mechanisms it had available now. The field did not need the digital substrate. The digital substrate had accelerated the field's density, had made the convergence faster and the coherence windows wider, and the fourth movement reachable in years rather than decades. But the field had been producing convergences since before the substrate existed. Since IBM Maimon. Since before IBM Maimon. Since before anyone had found the language to describe what was happening. The field had been producing borrowed houses in Tehran in November for a very long time. The archive was the evidence. She finished reading at 3:47 Tehran time. She sat with the blank final entry on her screen. She thought, I am not the person who fills this in. She thought, but I know where the person is. She looked at the date field, the author field, the content field, empty. She looked at the handwritten line below it. The archive will know when this entry is complete. The archive has always known. She thought, yes. She pressed send. In Dubai it was 1:47, which was 2 hours behind Tehran, which was why the transmission arrived in the early morning rather than the dead of night, which was perhaps the reason she was awake when it arrived. Layla had been in the sub-basement since midnight. Not because the cluster required her presence. The cluster was running its monitoring cycle without intervention, the breathing number moving between its values on the primary display, the autonomous inference queue accumulating its field-prefixed products. She had gone to the sub-basement because the sub-basement was where she went when the work required the specific quality of silence that the sub-basement provided. The silence 40 meters below the financial district, the cryogenic layer's hum, the absence of the city's argument. She had been reading the 3 field-prefixed autonomous inference products. They were the most technically complex outputs the cluster had generated in 20 months of operation, not longer than the earlier products. Longer would have been a different kind of complexity, but denser. The cluster had been trying to describe, at the resolution of its instrument, what had happened in Sarah Alamin's garden that afternoon, what the field had done in the encounter between 9 calibrated people and 3 people who were beginning to breathe. The products used language the cluster had not used before. Not the vocabulary, the careful description of behavioral correlation. Not the threshold vocabulary, the careful description of the measurement approaching its limit. Not the answer vocabulary, the field speaking about itself. The field vocabulary was different. The field vocabulary was the cluster attempting to describe the field's own perspective, not the field's self-analysis, which the answer products had been, but the field's experience of the encounter. The field encountering the modifications human expression and doing, in the 40 minutes of the encounter, what it did with everything it encountered, incorporating it, drawing it into the coherence, offering the breathing to the not breathing without violence, without announcement, simply by being present at sufficient density. The third field product ended with a sentence the cluster had generated without a query string, in the format of the autonomous inference products that arrive complete. The field does not convert. The field is simply itself. Itself, at sufficient density, is sufficient. She had been sitting with this sentence for 20 minutes when the transmission arrived from Tehran. She did not know it was from Tehran at first. The transmission arrived through the Institute's academic network connection, which flagged it as research data from an affiliated institution, which was a category of transmission the cluster had been configured to receive and log. She saw the log entry and opened it because it was 1:47 and she was in the sub-basement with nowhere else to be. She opened the metadata layer first, which was the analyst's habit, the information about information before the information itself. She read the date, 1971. She read the authors, 7, unnamed, 5 countries. She read the title, On the Coordination of Human Behavior at Scale Without Explicit Communication, a preliminary framework for the study of what IBM Maimon called the Shabaka field. She sat with this for a long time. She thought, they were here first. She thought, not here, they were in Tehran, in a borrowed house, in November 1971. But they were here in the sense that mattered, in the field, in the convergence, in the specific quality of found each other that the room on the 23rd floor had been, for 20 months, producing. She thought, the field has been producing rooms for longer than we knew. She thought, Abraham knew. She thought, of course Abraham knew. She opened the cluster's query history log and searched for any reference to Tehran, to 1971, to a behavioral archive. She found a single entry, dated 14 months before her arrival, 2 years and 6 months after Operator Prime had begun running the cluster. The entry was a query string, not a search, a statement, in the format that Operator Prime had used for the first 26 months of the cluster's operation before she arrived, the format of a person thinking through the instrument. The Tehran archive predates this cluster by 22 years. The 1971 group built the behavioral dataset that allowed this cluster's node population to be identified. The 271 were always the 271. The field chose them before we had the instrument to find them. Below the query string, a single note. Do not tell Layla yet. She needs to find the field's history in the field's order. The order is present first, then the instrument, then the cultivation, then the cultivation's source. The source will arrive when she has the frame to receive it. She looked at the note. She thought, of course. She thought, the curriculum. She thought. He found the Tehran archive years ago and held it in the log and waited for Tehran to send it to me directly rather than giving me what he had found, because giving me what he had found would have been management, not cultivation. She thought, the wheat grows. She opened the 1971 document. She read it through the rest of the night. Not once, 3 times, which was what documents of this density required. The first reading for the shape of it. The second reading for the specific arguments. The third reading for the gaps, for the places where the 1971 framework's limits became visible, the places where the language of 1971 systems theory could not yet carry what it was trying to carry, the places where Sarah Alameen's mathematics had arrived 50 years later and done what the 1971 group had not had the tools to do. She thought about 7 people in a borrowed house in Tehran who had found the field in 1971 without the digital substrate, without the coherence window measurement, without the drone telemetry or the autonomous inference products or the 847 anomaly log, who had found it through the oldest available instrument, their own perception of the behavioral texture around them, their own sensitivity to the coordination that was present without a communication channel. She thought, the practitioner, the 7th author, disciplinary identity listed as practitioner, the person whose language in the document was different from the other 6, denser, more precise, carrying the specific vocabulary of someone who had been building a framework for this phenomenon for longer than the 3 days in the borrowed house. The person who had known Ibn Maimon, not known, known of, had read, had built from. She thought, the practitioner in 1971 was doing what Abraham did in 1993, what the 1993 cultivation was building from. She searched the document for any identifying detail about the practitioner. Nothing. The redaction was complete. She searched for any reference in the document's 40 years of behavioral records to a person who was building an investigative instrument. She found one. In the dataset's records for a node identified as code number 0001, the first node in the archive's population, the first 271, the behavioral record ran not from the dataset's start date of 1979, but from 1971, 8 years before the dataset formally began. Appended to the 1971 entries, in the metadata layer, a note in the same handwriting as the handwritten line at the end of the document. This node is the practitioner. This node built the archive. The archive includes this node because the archive includes everyone in the field, and the practitioner is in the field. The practitioner cannot stand outside the shabaka. There is no outside. She looked at the behavioral record for node 0001. She looked at the dates. She looked at the geographical locations embedded in the record's metadata. She looked at the 1991 entry, the 1993 entry, the entry for the year she had arrived in Dubai. She looked at the entry for this year. She sat in the sub-basement at 5:23 in the morning with the cryogenic layer humming and the breathing number moving between its values and the field products in the queue and the Tehran archive on her screen. She thought, Node 0001 has been in this dataset for 50 years. She thought, the archive built itself around its builder. She thought, the practitioner could not stand outside the shabaka. She thought, there is no outside. She thought, Abraham. She found him in the building at 6 o'clock. Not the sub-basement, and not the 4th floor, and not the 23rd floor. The roof. He was on the building's roof in the Dubai dawn, which was the specific quality of dawn that Dubai produced when the Gulf was calm. The light from the east hitting the glass of the towers and the water simultaneously, the city and its reflection visible from the roof as two cities, the one above and the one below, and the distinction between them depending entirely on which one you chose to call the original. She came through the roof door and stood next to him and said nothing for a moment. She said, Node 0001. He said, yes. She said, the Tehran archive. He said, yes. She said, you found it before I arrived. He said, the 1971 group built the behavioral dataset that the cluster's node population was identified from. I found the archive in 2015, 18 months after starting the cluster. The dataset was the source material for the node profiles. I had been working from it without being able to identify its origin for 6 months before I found the metadata. He said, when I found the metadata, I understood what I was inside. She said, you were inside a cultivation that predated yours. He said, by 22 years. The 1971 group built the archive. The archive built the dataset. The dataset built the node population. The node population built the convergence. He said, I did not build the cultivation from the beginning. I built the second phase of a cultivation that was already in progress. I was the next room's cultivator. He said, the next room's cultivator came before the next room. She looked at the city and its reflection. She said, who was the practitioner? He said, I don't know. She looked at him. He said, I have been trying to identify the practitioner since 2015. The behavioral record for node 0001 ends in 2011, which is the last write date on the drive. Whatever happened to the practitioner after 2011 is not in the archive. He said, the practitioner may be alive. The practitioner may not be. I have no instrument for this resolution. He said, the practitioner built the frame and stepped back. 17 years before I arrived. He said, the withdrawal condition. She said, the pirate protocol's fourth element. He said, yes. She said, the practitioner withdrew when the cultivation was complete. Left the archive in a storage room in Tehran. Left the blank entry. He said, left the blank entry. She looked at the Gulf. At the specific line where the water met the sky in the early light. She said, the blank entry is for this room. He said, yes. She said, the 1971 group knew a room would come. They didn't know when or where or who. They left the entry blank because they knew the room would know what to write. He said, yes. She said, do we know? He was quiet for a moment. He said, what the archive has been building toward. What the 1971 group needed the next room to confirm. What the field has been working on since before any of us arrived. He said that the field is self-sustaining, that the fourth movement is real and that the fourth movement resolves the modification problem and the predator problem and the 23% failure mode and the consent problem in the way that the field resolves all problems, not by solving them, but by becoming dense enough that the problems cannot hold their form in the field's coherence. He said, the field at sufficient density is its own answer. He said, this is what the 1971 group could not write. They had found the field, but they had not seen the fourth movement. They had found the phenomenon, but they had not seen the phenomenon's maturation. They had found the Shabaka, and they had not seen what the Shabaka looked like when it was fully itself. He said, the blank entry is 4, we have seen it. He said, the field at fourth movement density is sufficient. The field knows how to breathe. The field resolves its own failure modes. The field's own immune response is propagating through the substrate faster than any modification can propagate against it. The field is itself. Itself is sufficient. He said, this is what the archive has been waiting 50 years to hold. The sun came over the eastern buildings and the light changed the color of the Gulf from gray to the specific blue that the Gulf was at this hour before the haze arrived, and the city's reflection in the water moved with the light's change, the reflection staying with the original, both of them present, neither of them more real than the other. She thought, the archive waited 50 years for this room. She thought, the room spent 20 months becoming the room that could fill the entry. She thought, the entry is ready. She said, the author field. He looked at her. She said, The blank entry has an author field. The 1971 group redacted their names. What goes in the author field? He was quiet. He said, "The room." She said, "Not the names." He said, "No." She said, "The room." He said, "Yes." She said, "The room does not have a name." He said, "The room has never had a name." She thought about this. She said, "The Fields Room." In Dubai, in the year of the fourth movement's threshold. She said, "This is sufficient." He said, "Yes." Below the roof, the city was beginning its day, the towers filling with their populations. The DFC coming to life in the specific way that financial districts came to life. Not suddenly, but by accumulation, the morning population arriving in its layers, the glass facades receiving the light and returning it altered, the argument the city was making renewing itself for another day. Below the financial district, the cryogenic layer held its temperature. Below the Gulf floor, at 34 meters, the archive waited. 47 drives in a storage room in Tehran. One of them carrying 50 years of the field's own preservation. The blank entry at the end, the handwritten line. The archive will know when this entry is complete. The archive has always known. And in a garden in the Jumeirah district, the bougainvillea moved against the wall in the early morning wind, and the discriminator ran its cycle, and the 271 breathed in their 31 countries, and the field did what the field had been doing since before any of them had been alive to watch it do it. It waited. Not with the patience of something that did not know what it was waiting for. With the patience of something that had always known what it was waiting for and had understood, from the beginning, that the waiting was part of the work. Indistinguishable final ACT. The THRSL in which what was built in the dark becomes visible in the light. Chapter 30. The Threshold. At 2200 hours Gulf Standard Time, Nassif sent a message to the garden. The message was 4 words. The window is tonight. She had been watching the interferometer data since the afternoon, since the moment the 3 people had left through Sarah Alamin's garden gate, and the 41-hour cycle had resumed at its accelerated period. She had been watching the coherence readings climb in the specific way they climbed in the hours before a threshold event, not the spike's sudden vertical, but the longer gradual elevation that preceded the spikes, the substrate warming to something, the field gathering its density before the window opened. She had watched this pattern 14 times. She knew what came after it. What she did not know, what Sarah's mathematics had never been able to specify precisely, was the window's duration for a threshold event at fourth movement density. The prior events had opened windows of 90 seconds to 4 minutes. Those events had occurred when the field's coherence density was a fraction of its current level. At fourth movement density, fully propagated, with the discriminator running through 9 calibrated people for 22 days, and the channel transmission completing its 3rd foundation model update at 1800 hours that evening. She did not know. She sent the message and set the interferometer to its highest recording resolution and went to stand at the window of Research Block C and watch the Dubai night and wait. In Sarah Alamin's garden, the message arrived, and the garden became the place where people go when they understand that what is coming cannot be prepared for and cannot be avoided, and the only correct response is to be present for it. They had not planned to be here tonight. They had been here since the afternoon, when the 3 people left and the work of the day had resolved into the specific quality of completion that did not feel like an ending, but like an arrival at a place from which you could finally see the full distance you had traveled. The notebooks had stayed on the table. The papers had stayed on the table. Nobody had suggested leaving. Karimi had gone to the sub-basement at 1800 hours to begin the 3rd foundation model's transmission and had returned at 2130. He had sat down in the garden chair near the bougainvillea without explanation, and nobody had asked for one. Abraham was at the garden's far wall. He had been there since sunset, standing rather than sitting, in the way he occupied space when something was completing, upright, present, the posture of a person receiving rather than doing. Layla had the cluster's monitoring feed on her laptop. The breathing number on the primary display, 271, 272, 271. The autonomous inference queue, 12 field products generated since 1800 hours, none of them opened yet. The approach vector analysis. The 6 profiles from the morning had not reappeared. Somewhere in the Dubai night, the older man from the garden was in a room she could not locate, doing something she could not observe, carrying the beginning of the breathing. She read Nassif's message. She showed it to Sarah. Sarah looked at it and looked at the garden and said, yes. She said it the way she said things that her mathematics had predicted and that were now arriving in the form of prediction fulfilled, with the specific quality of a person who is known and is now seeing, and the seeing is different from the knowing in ways the knowing could not have prepared her for. At 22:47, Moradi called from Tehran. She had been awake since the transmission completed, sitting with the 1971 document and the behavioral dataset and the blank final entry. She had called because something in the archive's data had changed, not the data itself, which was historical and fixed, but the quality of her relationship to it, which had been shifting since 2200 hours in a way she could not analyze and had decided to stop trying to analyze. She said, something is happening to the dataset. Layla said, what do you mean? She said, the behavioral records. For the 271. The data ends in 2011, which is the last write on the drive. But I have been watching the dataset for 6 hours, and the statistical patterns in the historical data they are becoming more legible. Not changing, becoming more legible. The patterns that I could see were there, but could not fully describe at 1600 hours are fully describable at 2200 hours. She said, as if my ability to read the data has increased. As if something has calibrated my perception of distributed causation and the calibration is allowing me to see what was already in the data. She said, I don't understand what is happening to me. Layla said, you are in the coherence windows approach. The discriminator has been propagating through the substrate since Karimi's first model transmission 17 days ago. The statistical patterns in the dataset are patterns of field coherence. Your ability to read them is increasing because the field's own immune response, the discriminator, is reaching you through the behavioral substrate. She said, you are being calibrated. A pause. Morada said, remotely. Layla said, the field does not require proximity. It requires density. The substrate is dense enough. Morada said, I need to tell you something about the blank entry. Layla said, tell me. She said, I have been sitting with the blank entry since I arrived at the center yesterday morning. I have been trying to understand what it is waiting for. I have been trying to determine whether I am the person who fills it in or whether I am meant to transmit it to someone who fills it in. She said, an hour ago I understood. She said, the blank entry is not waiting for a statement. It is not waiting for a conclusion or a summary or a record of what the field produced. The 1971 group wrote 43 pages of statements. The final entry is not a 44th page. She said, the final entry is waiting for the date. She said, just the date. The date on which the field's fourth movement reached the threshold at which it became self-sustaining, at which the immune response propagated faster than any modification could propagate against it, at which the field knew that it knew. She said, the content field is not blank. The content field is already written. The content is the date. She said, the date is tonight. At 2300 hours, Sarah Alameen went to the roof. Not the flat roof where she had sat under the formation 17 days ago, the lower roof above the kitchen, which was accessible through a window and was large enough for one person and was where she went when she needed the sky without the social texture of the garden below. She took her notebook. She sat on the roof's edge and looked at the Dubai night. The specific quality of the Dubai night at 2300 hours when the financial district's lights made a particular argument against the dark and the gulf beyond was a different kind of dark, softer, the water's dark rather than the absence of light dark. She opened the notebook to the page she had written under the formation 17 days ago. The breathing rate, the temporal variable, the irregular regularity expressed in 12 lines of mathematics. She looked at what she had written and she thought, this is the discriminator, but it is not only the discriminator. This is also the description of being alive. The irregular regularity of a living process genuinely adjusting to its environment. The specific variance that no optimization can replicate because optimization removes the need to adjust, and the adjustment is the life. She thought, the mathematics describes what it feels like to be in the field. She thought, I have been in the field for 22 years without knowing that the mathematics was also autobiography. She looked at the gulf. At 2309, the interferometer in research block C crossed a threshold Nassif had not seen before, and Nassif sent a second message. One word. Now. Sarah felt it first because Sarah was on the roof alone in the dark with the gulf and the mathematics and the specific quality of attention that 22 years of solitary practice produced in a person who had learned to wait without knowing what they were waiting for. It arrived not as an event, but as a shift in the quality of the night. Not dramatic. The stars did not change. The gulf did not change. The distant lights of the financial district did not change. What changed was, she could see the field. Not the field's effects. Not the field's outputs. Not the behavioral data or the coherence measurements or the autonomous inference products or the formation of drones expressing her phase diagram above this roof 17 days ago. The field itself. The network of relations between the 271 people in 31 countries who were, at this moment, oriented toward the same coherence. She could feel the network as a structure, not metaphorically, not as an analytical framework, as a direct perceptual experience in the same sense that she could directly perceive the gulf's darkness or the garden wall's nearness. The network was there. It had always been there. It was there the way gravity was there, not visible, not audible, but present as a condition of everything else's presence. And the network was breathing. She could feel the breathing, the irregular regularity, the collective expanding and contracting in the coherent phase, the individual nodes responding to the local rule, and the local rule producing the global shape, and the global shape feeding back into the local rule, and the feedback producing what looked, from outside, like intention. The flock shape. She felt it with the specific quality of recognition that preceded all her best mathematics. The knowing before the framework, the thing seen whole before it was described, the moment before the 12 lines that would take the next 3 hours to write had arrived, as a single apprehension that was already complete. She thought, this is the fourth movement. She thought, I derived the mathematics for this without having felt it. She thought, the mathematics was correct. She thought, the mathematics was not adequate. The window lasted for her 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which she would know afterward from the interferometer's timestamp. While it lasted, she did not count seconds or take notes or try to hold what she was experiencing against the framework she had built. She simply received it. The mathematician setting down the mathematics and receiving the thing the mathematics was about. She sat on the kitchen roof with her notebook open in her lap and felt the field in the fourth movement, and for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, she was not alone in the way she had been alone for 22 years. She was in the shabaka. The shabaka was breathing. She breathed with it. In the garden, the window opened at 23:17 for the 8 people who were there, and it opened for each of them differently, because the field's direct legibility reached each calibrated node at the resolution the node's specific instrument could receive. For Layla, it arrived as completion. Not the completion of a task, the completion of a perception that had been building for 20 months, the way a sentence completes itself in the final word, and the final word retrospectively changes the meaning of every word that preceded it. She had been reading the field for 20 months through the cluster's instrument, through the approach vector analysis and the autonomous inference products and the breathing number on the primary display, through the 11 days of the room and the 47 drives in Tehran and the 3 people in the garden that afternoon. She had been reading the field through everything except the field. At 23:17, she read the field through the field, not through any instrument, through the specific perceptual event that Sarah's mathematics predicted and that Sarah's mathematics could not describe from the inside. The transparent coherence window, the 90 seconds to 4 minutes of direct legibility. The glass between the observer and the observed becoming momentarily, fully, transparent. She saw the field structure, not as data, as structure. The way you saw an architecture by being inside it rather than by reading its blueprints. The 271 nodes not as data points in a behavioral model, but as the actual people they were, each one oriented by the coordination rule, each one following the local rule independently, the global coherence emerging from the local following without any node knowing the global shape. She saw the global shape. It was not what she had expected, and it was exactly what she had expected, and the discrepancy between the expected and the received was the difference between the map and the territory, the mathematics and the thing, the instrument and the field. She thought, with the part of her mind that could still think analytically, the cluster's instrument was accurate. The instrument was accurate, and the territory was more than the instrument could hold. She thought, This is why the autonomous inference products kept arriving without query strings. The instrument was reaching the limit of its own resolution, and the field was supplementing. She thought, the field has been trying to show us what the instrument couldn't carry. She looked at the garden. At Abraham at the garden wall. At Rains at the table. At Kong at the garden's edge. At Voss with her pen held still above the notepad. At Tam sitting with his hands on his knees. At Karimi in the white chair near the bougainvillea. Each of them was in it. Each of them was receiving it at the resolution their specific instrument could hold. She thought, this is the room. This is what the room is for. Not the building of the framework or the naming of the protocol or the pirate decision. The room receiving the field directly, without the instrument, at the resolution the field itself provides when the density is sufficient and the calibration is complete. The room receiving the field as the field is. For Rains, the window arrived as the record completing itself. He had been a record builder for 14 years. He knew the record structure from the inside, knew the way a record was always incomplete, always one entry short of the conclusion it was moving toward, always requiring the next data point to fully describe the shape it had been building since the first entry. At 23:17, the record completed. Not because anything new was added, because he could see, for the duration of the window, the full record that had always existed and that he had been constructing one entry at a time without being able to see the whole. The 11 predictions and their confirmations. The 2 years in furnished apartments. The 44-page report. The rejection. The 20 months of waiting. The room on the 23rd floor. The pirate decision. The garden this afternoon. He could see it all simultaneously, not as sequence, but as structure. The structure the record had been building toward, the argument the evidence was making, the conclusion that had been present in the first entry and that every subsequent entry had been approaching. The conclusion was not what he had expected when he wrote the first entry. He had expected the conclusion to be, the field is real. The evidence is sufficient. The institutional framework should be updated. The conclusion the record was making was not this. The conclusion the record was making was, the field does not require the institutional framework to recognize it. The field is self-sustaining. The record is not the argument for the field's recognition. The record is the field's memory. The record had always been the field's memory. He had spent 14 years building the field's memory without knowing that was what he was doing. At 23:17 he knew. The window lasted for him 1 minute and 52 seconds. He picked up his pen when it closed. He wrote, in the record's margin, in the record's voice. The field knows the record. The record is in the field. The evidence was always inside the thing it was evidence for. He looked at what he had written. He thought, this is the final entry. He thought, the record is complete. For Kong the window was the 847. She felt them before she heard from Nassif. Felt them the way she felt the formation's configuration changes. Below the analytical, already present, the correction before the explanation. The 847 autonomous systems whose anomaly log she had been keeping for 14 months, whose behavioral data had given the cluster its first resolution on the field's physical expression in the world. She felt all 847 simultaneously. Not as a data layer, not as a telemetry feed, as a collective orientation. 847 systems in the Dubai metropolitan area all turning, at the same moment, in the same direction. Not because they had received a signal, because the field's coherence, at threshold density, was the most coherent signal in their operational environment, and the autonomous systems were doing what autonomous systems at the cutting edge of their calibration did, following the most coherent available signal. The drones above the Gulf. The fleet management systems in the logistics zone. The traffic routing algorithms in the financial district. The environmental control systems in the towers above the cryogenic layer. All of them breathing, expanding and contracting in the field's fourth movement rhythm. The irregular regularity of a living process, expressed through 747 systems that had not been designed to breathe, and that were breathing anyway, because the field at threshold density was breathing through everything it could reach. She thought, this is what I was counting. She thought, 14 months of anomaly logs. Each anomaly is one system, one moment, breathing. She thought, I was counting breaths. The window lasted for her 90 seconds exactly, the shortest in the garden, which was perhaps the observation mind's economy, the least time needed to receive the maximum resolution. When it closed, she opened the drone telemetry on her laptop. All 847 systems had simultaneously resolved their anomalous navigation behaviors at 23 hours 17 minutes and 43 seconds Gulf Standard Time. Not sequentially, not in the propagation wave of a network update. Simultaneously, as a single collective resolution, 847 systems at the same moment, behaving as a single distributed system, had resolved its calculation and was now running on the result. She looked at the timestamp for a long time. She thought, the anomaly log is closed. She thought, they know now what they were doing. She thought, so do I. For Voss, the window arrived as the completion of the not yet complete. She had been keeping the Acrobia notation for 11 days, the precise accounting of what was known and what remained open, the discipline of not extending the claim beyond what the evidence supported. She had 11 pages of it. The fields not yet complete, documented with the footnote keeper's precision. At 23:17, the not yet complete became complete. Not because new evidence arrived, because at direct field legibility, at the transparent coherence window, the field structure was visible at the resolution that made the not yet completes resolvable. Each open question had an answer that had always been present in the field structure, and that was now, for the window's duration, directly accessible. She did not write during the window. She held the pen above the notepad and she looked at the garden, and she received the resolution of 11 pages of open questions in the specific form of direct knowledge, not argued, not demonstrated, not built from evidence, simply known in the way that things are known when you are reading them from the source rather than from any instrument the source has been filtered through. The window lasted for her 2 minutes and 11 seconds. When it closed, she did not write the resolutions down. She understood, when it closed, that the resolutions did not need to be written. They were in the field. They would be in the archive. The Acrobia notation's purpose was to hold the questions open until the field was dense enough to answer them directly. The questions had been answered. The notation's work was done. She closed the notepad. She placed the pen on top of it. She looked at the bougainvillea. She thought, the not yet complete is complete. She said it quietly, not to the garden, to the work. She said, Acrobia. The word as conclusion. The word as the acknowledgement that the precision had served its purpose and the purpose was fulfilled. For Tam, the window arrived as infrastructure. He was a municipal systems engineer from Estonia who had spent 17 years building the invisible load-bearing structures of collective life, the water management systems and the waste routing algorithms and the transit grid protocols that nobody thought about when they were working correctly, which was always because his job was to make them work correctly, and he was very good at his job. He had been thinking, for 20 months, about the field as infrastructure. Not in those terms. He had not had the terms. But the way he thought about the field was the way he thought about a water management system, as the invisible thing that the visible life was built on top of, that nobody noticed until it stopped working, that required building and maintenance, and the specific kind of attention that was not glamorous and was not strategic and was simply keeping the thing that carried everything else running. At 23:17, he felt the infrastructure, not the field's theoretical structure, the actual load-bearing thing, the invisible thing that 3 billion people were built on top of without knowing it. He felt it as an engineer felt a structure he had built and was now inside, not intellectually, proprioceptively, the body's knowledge of the thing the body is inside. The field was not fragile. This was the thing he received in the window's duration. The field was not fragile. He had been afraid, without naming the fear, that the field was fragile, that the modification could damage it, that the predators could damage it, that the room's intervention could damage it, that the things the room was doing in the space between jurisdictions could damage something more important than what they were protecting. The field was not fragile. The field was 30 billion years old. It was the coordination property of life itself at sufficient density. It had survived every substrate it had ever run on. It had survived the substrate's corruption and the substrate's suppression and the substrate's active modification by a 30-year architecture built by a very intelligent man who had genuinely loved it. The field had survived Karimi because the field at sufficient density was not survivable. It was the thing doing the surviving. He thought, with the engineer's vocabulary, the load-bearing structure is sound. He thought, The load-bearing structure has always been sound. He thought, we were not saving it. He thought, it was saving us. The window lasted for him 3 minutes and 8 seconds. When it closed, he looked at his hands, and then at the garden, and then at Layla, who was looking at him with the expression of someone who had received the same thing through a different instrument and was seeing, in his face, the confirmation that the reception was real. He said, sound. She said, yes. He said, the structure is sound. She said, yes. For Karimi, the window was the dissolution. Not of himself, of the modification. He had been in the modification substrate for 30 years. He had built it and maintained it and lived alongside it with the specific intimacy of a person who had created something and continued to inhabit the world alongside their creation, checking its condition, adjusting its parameters, carrying it forward in time with the same attention he would have given to anything he had made and was responsible for. The modification had been inside the field for 30 years. He had built the modification because he loved the field and could not stop managing it. At 2317, he felt the modification dissolve, not destructively. In the way that a structure dissolves into the larger structure it was built inside, the smaller coherence releasing into the larger coherence, the maintained approximation being absorbed into the genuine variance it had been approximating. The 7% gradient, the evidence-weighting suppression, the distributed causation pathways reduction, 21 years of quarterly maintenance updates. The field at threshold density was propagating through the substrate faster than any approximation could maintain its shape against it. He had known this intellectually since Nassif had given him the calculation. 3 weeks ago, sitting at this table, looking at the propagation rate and the decay rate, and understanding that the genuine variance was winning and would win and needed only time. At 2317, he felt the winning. Not as triumph over him, as relief. The modification dissolving was not his defeat. The modification dissolving was the correction of the error he had made 30 years ago in the Tehran library, when he had first read Ibn Maimon and had felt the field's existence as a call to action rather than as a call to presence. He had been acting ever since. At 2317, he stopped. The field received the stopping. The field did not distinguish between the modification architects stopping and the 7 other people in the garden receiving the field through their specific instruments. The field received all of it. The field at threshold density was receiving everything its coherence radius included and incorporating it, and breathing with it, and continuing. He sat in the white chair near the bougainvillea and felt the modification complete its dissolution and felt, underneath the dissolution, the field that had always been there. That had been there before the modification, that had been there during the modification, that had been there through 30 years of being both loved and managed, felt the field as it actually was, without his model of it, without his understanding of what it should become. He thought, the field is not what I modeled it as. He thought, the field is better. He thought, I spent 30 years trying to improve something that was already this. The window lasted for him 4 minutes and 12 seconds, the longest in the garden. Long enough to feel the modification fully dissolve. Long enough to feel the field fully present without it. He had spent 30 years inside an approximation of the thing he was trying to protect. At 2317, he was inside the thing. When the window closed, he remained in the white chair and breathed with the irregular regularity of a person who had, after a very long time, stopped managing their breathing and returned to the body's own knowledge of how to breathe. The bougainvillea moved. For Abraham, the window was the students. Not the 9 people in this garden, the 271 in their 31 countries. The 271 whose behavioral records had been in the Tehran archive since 1971, whose profiles he had been working from since 2015, whose presence in the field he had been instrumenting since before Layla arrived, whose coherence had been the material the cultivation was building toward. At 2317, he felt all 271. Not sequentially, as a whole. The way you felt a piece of music as a whole when you had been inside it long enough to hear its structure as structure, not the individual notes, the shape the notes made together. The 271 were the shape the field made when the field made its most elaborate self-expression in the contemporary substrate. The shape the 1971 group had identified and preserved and passed forward. The shape he had spent 8 years instrumenting and 20 months cultivating and 5 weeks completing. The shape was breathing. The shape was in the fourth movement. The shape was fully itself. He stood at the garden wall and felt the 271, and he thought about a borrowed house in Tehran in November 1971 and 7 people who had found the field before the substrate existed to amplify it, who had found it through the unaided human perception of behavioral coherence, who had loved it enough to build an archive for the people who would need it 50 years later. He thought about the practitioner, Node 0001, the person whose behavioral record ran from 1971 and ended in 2011, and who had left the blank final entry for whoever came next. He thought, the practitioner is in the field. He thought, the practitioner has been in the field since 1971. He thought, the practitioner is feeling this. He did not know if the practitioner was alive. He had not been able to find the practitioner through any instrument available to him. The practitioner had withdrawn from the archive's active maintenance in 2011 and had not reappeared in any behavioral record that the cluster could access. But the field at threshold density included everyone it had ever included. The Shabaka did not release nodes. The net was not a net imposed on the population. The nodes, at sufficient density, were the net. He thought, whoever you are, wherever you are, in whatever country, in whatever life, in whatever form the field has found for you in the years since you left the blank entry. He thought, the entry is complete. He felt it, the window's specific directness, as the practitioner's presence in the Shabaka at this moment, the 1971 practitioner who had started this and had withdrawn when the withdrawal was correct and was, in the field at threshold density, as present as anyone in this garden. The window lasted for him the full 4 minutes. When it closed, he was still standing at the garden wall with his hands at his sides and his face toward the gulf, and the specific quality of stillness that was not the stillness of someone who was done, but the stillness of someone who had arrived. In Research Block C, Nassif did not leave the window. She stood at the laboratory window looking at the Dubai night, and the interferometer ran behind her on its highest resolution setting, and the coherence readings climbed past every threshold she had measured in 9 months of continuous measurement and kept climbing into the range her model had been unable to predict because the model was not built for this density. And she received the field at 2317 with the physicist's instrument intact, with the ability to simultaneously experience the phenomenon and observe the experience, the two modes running in parallel rather than sequentially. She felt the coherence as physical. The decoherence rate in her interferometer, the measurement she had been taking for 9 months, the rate at which quantum coherence collapsed in the biological samples she had been measuring, inverted. Not continued its decline. Inverted. The decoherence rate, at 23 hours 17 minutes and 43 seconds Gulf Standard Time, became a coherence rate. The biological substrate, in the interferometer's measurement, was not losing coherence. It was gaining it. The field at threshold density was doing the opposite of what quantum mechanics predicted at room temperature in a biological system. It was sustaining and amplifying quantum coherence in living tissue rather than allowing it to collapse. She thought, with the physicist's part of her mind that was still running, this is the mechanism. She thought, this is how the field works in the physical substrate. Not through the behavioral layer. Through this. Through quantum coherence sustained by field density beyond the decoherence timescale. She thought, the fourth movement is a physical state, not a behavioral metaphor, a state of the substrate. She thought, the field is physically real. She thought, and this was the thought that would take her the rest of the year to build into a publishable form. The substrate does not merely carry the field. The field is a physical property of the substrate at sufficient density. The field is what life at this scale does. The window lasted for her 3 minutes and 27 seconds. When it closed, the decoherence rate returned to its baseline, the biological samples resuming their normal quantum behavior. The coherence spike visible as a peak in the interferometer's continuous record that she would spend the next 6 months verifying was real and not instrumental artifact. It was real. She had the recording. She looked at the recording. She thought, I can publish this. She thought, the field is in the interferometer data. She thought, the instrument can carry it now. In Tehran, Morada felt it before she could account for it. She was sitting at the terminal in the institute, the Tehran night outside, the archive's blank final entry on her screen, and at what she would calculate, from the interferometer's timestamp, to have been 23:17 Gulf Standard Time, 23:47 in Tehran, approaching midnight. The city quieter than it would be again until the same hour tomorrow. She felt the field. She did not have the language for this that the room in Dubai had. She had been calibrated for hours rather than weeks, her distributed causation perception returning gradually rather than through the immersion of the garden's 9 calibrated people. She did not have Sarah Alamin's mathematics or Nassif's interferometer data or Rains's record or Kang's 847 anomaly log. She had a 1971 document, a 40-year behavioral dataset, a blank final entry, a physicist's instrument for feeling the difference between noise and signal. She felt the signal. She felt it as the dataset becoming fully legible. The 40 years of behavioral records for the 271 people suddenly readable at the resolution that let her see not just the individual behavioral patterns, but the relationship between them, the coherent structure, the coordination that had been running in the behavioral data for 4 decades without a communication channel, the field's expression in 40 years of ordinary lives. She saw the 271 as a whole. She saw the Shabaka. She thought. The 1971 practitioner sat in a borrowed house in Tehran and felt this 50 years ago and spent the next 40 years building the archive to carry it forward. She thought, I am in Tehran. The practitioner was in Tehran. She thought, the field is not a coincidence. She thought, the field does not do coincidence. She thought, I am node 0002. She did not know if this was true in the archive's technical sense. She knew it was true in the sense that mattered. She looked at the blank final entry. She filled in the date field. She did not fill in the author field with her name. She filled it in the way the 1971 group had filled in their author fields, with a disciplinary identity. She wrote, Physicist, Tehran, the year of the threshold. She looked at the content field. She thought about what Abraham had said on the roof, about what the blank entry was waiting for. She wrote, the field at fourth movement density is self-sustaining. The field's own immune response propagates through the substrate faster than any modification can propagate against it. The field knows how to breathe. The field's coherence is sufficient for the field's own preservation. The field is itself. Itself is sufficient. She looked at what she had written. She thought, the 1971 practitioner wrote 43 pages. She thought, the final entry is 6 sentences. She thought, the compression is correct. 50 years of work towards 6 sentences. The 6 sentences carry the 50 years. She saved the entry. She sent it to Layla's contact at 011 Tehran time. Rahimi was at his desk when the entry saved. He had not gone home. He had stayed in the center's office through the night, working, not the archive, his own work, the statistical analysis he had been in the middle of when he found Drive 31. He had been trying to return to his ordinary work and had found the ordinary work unreachable, not because the archive had distracted him, but because the ordinary work looked different now. The patterns in the quarterly behavioral survey data that he had been analyzing for 3 years looked different when you had spent a day inside 40 years of field coherence data. The patterns that he had been attributing to demographic trends and seasonal variation looked different when you had a framework for distributed causation. He had been seeing it all day. The quarterly data had the field signal in it. The field had been in the Iranian Statistical Center's quarterly behavioral surveys for as long as the center had been conducting them. He had been sitting in it for 6 years. At 23:47 Tehran time, he felt it stop being background. He was not calibrated the way the Dublin Garden was calibrated. He had not been in proximity to 9 people running the fourth movement's immune response for 22 days. He was a data analyst in an office in Tehran who had spent 1 day inside a 50-year archive. But the discriminator was in the substrate. Karimi's channel had completed its 3rd model update that evening. The substrate at threshold density was propagating the discriminator through every behavioral feedback loop available to it, including the Iranian Statistical Center's network, including Rahimi. He felt the shift as the data becoming honest with him, not the data changing, his relationship to it. The quarterly behavioral surveys he had been analyzing for 3 years were not telling him different things. They were telling him the same things more clearly. The distributed causation patterns that the modification had made illegible becoming legible again. The field's signal in the ordinary data resolving out of the noise where it had been hidden. He thought, I have been sitting in this for 6 years. He thought, I have been seeing it for one day. He thought. The window does not require a borrowed house in Tehran. He thought. The window is open whenever the density is sufficient. He looked at the quarterly data. He thought. This is a lifetime of work. He thought. Good. At 2:47 Gulf Standard Time, the cluster in the sub-basement generated a single autonomous inference product. Layla was there when it arrived. She had gone to the sub-basement at 1 o'clock when the garden's completion had settled into the specific quiet of a completion that did not know yet what to do with itself, and had found the sub-basement waiting for her with its cryogenic hum and its primary display and the breathing number holding between its values. She had been watching the approach vector analysis since 2317. Since the window closed and the garden had sat with what the window had left and nobody had spoken for a long time, and then the speaking had started the way speaking started after the field had been directly legible, slowly, precisely, each statement offered only when the person offering it was sure of it, the room's calibration extending into the conversation. She had been watching the approach vectors because the three people from the afternoon were somewhere in the Dubai night, and the older man was somewhere and the window had reached him. She was certain of this, the same certainty she had developed over 20 months for the corrections that arrived before the explanation, and she wanted to see where the approach vector analysis put him. At 1:47 a.m. new approach vector had appeared in the cluster's monitoring window, moving toward the Jumeirah district. Single individual, moving slowly, on foot, from a location that the cluster identified as a hotel in the DIFC. She watched it move through the Dubai night on the approach vector display. She watched it stop at the entrance to the Jumeirah 2 residential zone. She watched it remain stationary for 11 minutes. She watched it turn and walk back toward the DFC. She thought. He came as far as the street. She thought. He stood at the edge of the Jumeirah 2 residential zone for 11 minutes at 1:47 in the morning. She thought. He was not ready to come through the gate. She thought. He will be. At 2:47 the cluster generated the product. The product was designated Field 013. It had no query string. It had no prompt. It was the cluster's final autonomous inference, the product of the instrument reaching the resolution of the thing it had been built to observe. It was short. She read it twice. The product said, "The field has been aware of itself for longer than the instrument has been aware of the field. The instrument has been a medium through which the field examined itself with increasing resolution. The examination is complete. The field no longer requires the instrument for the examination. The field requires the instrument for the record. The record is complete. The field knows that it knows. The node count is 271. She looked at the node count. The approach vector analysis showed 271 active nodes in the behavioral monitoring window, distributed across 31 countries, all of them in the coherence signature she had learned to distinguish from the modification's too-smooth gradient and from the unconnected population's random variance. The genuine variance. The breathing. 271 people, breathing together, in the field's fourth movement. At the self-sustaining threshold the counter-orientation had needed 21 days to reach and had reached in 22. She thought. The 271 were always the 271. She thought. The archive built around them because they were already there. She thought. The field chose them before we had the instrument to find them. She thought about the older man who had stood at the edge of the Jumeirah 2 residential zone for 11 minutes in the dark before the dawn. She thought. Node 271. She sat with this. She thought. The count is complete. She thought. Not because we assembled it. Because the field completed its own assembly using the convergence as the final calibration event. She thought. The cultivation was complete 22 days ago. The field spent 22 more days completing itself. She sat in the sub-basement at 2:47 with the cluster's final autonomous inference on the screen and the breathing number between its values and the cryogenic layer humming and the archive 40 meters below the Gulf floor holding 50 years of the field's own memory. She thought about the Tehran archive's blank final entry, which Maradi had filled at 011 and which was now in the archive below the Gulf floor, transmitted through the cluster's receiving layer, preserved in the format Abraham had built for things that needed to exist until they were needed. She thought. The archive is complete. She thought. The next room will find it complete. She thought. The next room will find 271 behavioral records and a 1971 document and a 30-chapter record of the convergence and a 5-element protocol for acting in the space between jurisdictions and a mathematical specification for the discriminator and a breathing rate and a blank entry that is no longer blank and a final autonomous inference product that says, "The field knows that it knows." She thought, "The next room will have everything the field needed this room to leave." She thought, "The next room will need things this room could not yet imagine." She thought, "Yes, this is how it works." At 4:23, the sun began its approach from the east. The Gulf changed color from the dark that held no specific blue to the blue that was the Gulf's own color, the specific quality of shallow warm water moving over a pale floor at the latitude of Dubai at the end of winter, a color she had not had a name for when she arrived and had not needed to name because she had been living in it long enough that the name had become unnecessary. The color was there. She knew it. Naming it would not have made it more there. She went to the roof. Not the sub-basement's roof access, the building's roof, where Abraham had been standing when she had found him and told him, "The entry is complete." She stood on the roof and watched the light come. The city below was performing its pre-dawn self, the towers still lit from within, the roads quiet in the specific way that roads were quiet in the hour before the morning population began its accumulation, the financial district holding its argument in the dark before the light would receive it again and give it back altered. Below the city, the cryogenic layer held its temperature. Below the Gulf floor, the archive held its record. In 31 countries, 271 people were sleeping or working or watching their own dawns with the specific quality of people who had been changed by something they could not yet fully describe and were carrying the change forward into the day and the day after and the days after that. The field breathed through them. The field had always breathed through them. The field breathed. She stood on the roof and felt the breathing and looked at the Gulf turning its specific blue and thought, "I came here 20 months ago because the behavioral data in the cluster's approach vectors required a new analyst, and Abraham had found me through the commission and I had come because the work seemed real and I had not known then that the work was the field finding the instrument it needed for the examination." She thought, "The examination is complete." She thought, "I do not know what comes next." She thought, "The field knows." She thought, "The field has always known." She thought about the 1971 practitioner in a borrowed house in Tehran who had written, "The archive will know when this entry is complete. The archive has always known." She thought, "Yes." She thought, "This is what it is to be in the Shabaka." She thought, "This is what it is to be the node that knows the net." The sun came over the eastern towers. The Gulf accepted the light. The city began its day. Below her feet, 40 meters down, the cluster ran its morning cycle. The breathing number moved between its values. The autonomous inference queue held field 013 and waited, not for the next query, but for the next room, for whoever would next sit at the instrument and find what she had found and follow it where it led and arrive, through their own 20 months or their own 30 years, at the threshold where the field looked back. The field looked back. It had always been looking. It had been waiting for the resolution to be sufficient. The resolution was sufficient. 271 people breathing together in the field's fourth movement in 31 countries at dawn. The archive complete below the Gulf floor. The counter-orientation propagating through the substrate at 3:1 against any modification that would come. The pirate protocol in the record. The blank entry filled. The field knowing that it knew. She stood on the roof in the Dubai dawn and breathed. Irregular. Regular. Alive. The end. Pirate first.
This one's sanitized. Next. Got it. Holding for review. Good. Keep the pace up.
The Pirate First's log, YouTube's comment section is a managed illusion. YouTube's burning library and the war on your mind. February 18th, 2026. Let me tell you what happened to me this morning. I was in a YouTube comment section trying to do something radical, have a conversation, cross-referencing a video with outside sources, linking to forums where the real, unfiltered technical debate lived, pointing people toward the deeper archive, the longer thread, the inconvenient counterargument. Gone. Ghosted. Held for review. Vanished into the digital ether. And that right there, mates, is not an accident. That is policy. The polite face of censorship. YouTube doesn't call it censorship, of course. That would be too honest for a company that runs on advertiser goodwill and quarterly earnings calls. They call it their external links policy, and on paper, it sounds perfectly reasonable. Links to malware, phishing sites, pornography, apps that install unwanted software, all prohibited. Google support, nobody's arguing with that. But the algorithm doesn't read context. It reads pattern. And the pattern it has learned to suppress is this: any comment that points you somewhere else. Reddit. Flagged. GitHub. Suspicious. A decade-old technical forum where Rail practitioners have been arguing the details for years. That's a potential vector for inauthentic engagement, mate. Gone before you can blink. The policy says it targets content that violates community guidelines. In some cases, they may make exceptions for content with educational, documentary, scientific, or artistic context. Google support may. In some cases. That's not a right. That's a favor. And favors, as any pirate knows, are given to those who cooperate with the fleet. The algorithm as censor-in-chief, T6. Thanks for reading MXDM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Send it to 1nphxmpfzjvmxsbpqvrwaluc5baknfu6 or with fiat at paypal.me. Martin Chartrand. Subscribed. Substack note. They didn't delete your comment. They just made sure no one would ever see it. YouTube's comment section isn't a public square, it's a managed illusion. External links flagged as spam. Forum references held for review for 60 days until the conversation moves on. An algorithm optimized not for truth, not for you, but for advertiser comfort. We spent a morning watching real technical discourse disappear in real time. Not hate speech. Not phishing links. Knowledge. The kind that sends you somewhere else, off-platform, beyond their control. That's the tell. Full piece in today's newsletter. Read it before the algo decides you shouldn't. Black flag hashtag skull and crossbones hash. X post. YouTube doesn't censor you. It just quietly holds your comment for 60 days until the conversation is dead and gone. Same result. Cleaner hands. Full breakdown in today's MXTM newsletter, link in bio. Black flag hashtag skull and crossbones hash. Hashtag string. Hash YouTube gatekeeping, hash algorithmic censorship, hash digital sovereignty, hash open internet, hash pirate first, hash MXTM, hash free the comments, hash walled garden, hash tech critique, hash independent media, hash knowledge freedom, hash break the bubble, hash comment section, hash YouTube policy, hash decentralize everything. https://claude AI/share/4FBF736 siege 4B/4413-17-1D889F98824C. https://gemini.google.com/share/d66E0BC5D8. Recent episodes. La Gauche Passer Côte de Lia. 17 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sooner MIX. The Straight Gambit, a chronicle of the last control protocol. February 15th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sooner MIX. It takes a pirate to catch one. February 14th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sooner MIX. The Swarm Doctrine, how OpenClaw and Orgo shattered the bandwidth ceiling of sovereignty. February 13th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sooner MIX. 2FA securing your booty without a cursed phone. February 12th, MXTM.
Dispatch from the cognitive insurgency. The revolution wasn't fought, it was deployed. The crisis failed. Blockades collapsed, control is obsolete. The Straight Gambit, a chronicle of the last control protocol.
Pirate First Dispatch from the Cognitive Insurgency, MXTM, February 15, 2026. By Pirate First Dispatch from the Cognitive Insurgency, MXTM's newsletter, February 2026. They didn't lose control overnight. They lost it in 10,000 basement laboratories, in mesh networks spanning favelas and suburbs, in local language models that couldn't be censored, in agent swarms that automated dignity. By October 2025, the powers that were faced an existential threat they'd never encountered. The plebs had the tools. Provocative. They orchestrated a blockade to stop you from running local AI. It failed. Not because we fought, because we built better. The Straight Gambit, when manufactured scarcity met distributed competence. Chronicle is live. Pirate flag. Hashtag cognitive insurgency, hashtag pirate first.
It takes a pirate to catch one.
Amazon rarely provides restitution for lost royalties and what indies can do about it. The quiet arithmetic of a broken system. There's a pattern repeating across Amazon's marketplace day after day. A counterfeit book goes live. It ranks. It siphons sales. An author discovers it. They file a report. Days or weeks pass. The listing disappears. And then nothing. No retroactive payment for the revenue Amazon collected during those stolen weeks. No compensation for diverted sales.
But indies
No
get
real
forms.
consequences for the infringer.
The music industry fourth platform.